listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from just outside the capital of the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these 50 divided states and the increasingly divided, fragmented surface of our globe. In the Independent Corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan, and in the Independent Corner, or at least normally sitting there, we have the normal co-host of the show, the indefatigable Jamarl Thomas. He will be in shortly. But without further ado, let's get into the headlines. First up, well, actually, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Pardon me, I needed to close out that first little segment there. Let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, there are about 112,270 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday. Also about 725 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 96,036 cases per day. That's an increase of 131% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 50% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated at this point, and 58% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 35,438,424 people across the United States and killed 614,834 people. The Biden administration has said it is planning on putting in place entrance restrictions to the United States, requiring that visitors be vaccinated before arriving. This would come as a tool for reopening travel from other countries. The Biden administration has come under flack for not reopening travel from other countries, but, you know, Delta variant is kicking in a big way, and we are seeing rising cases as a response to that. So they've been resistant to the idea of it for months now, somewhat sensibly. In national news, well, really in local news here in D.C., if you live in the northeast region of D.C., do not drink the tap water without boiling it first. This comes after an advisory from D.C. Water, which was working on a main line in northwest D.C. yesterday. They believe bacteria could have entered the system, and within the hour, many of the valves in the area were shut off. Northeast is now under a boil advisory for water used in cooking, drinking, brushing teeth, and more. The advisory is expected to last until this weekend, until Saturday. Look out for symptoms of diarrhea, cramps, nausea, and headaches, and if those persist, do call a doctor, because that could get ugly. Lawyers for former President Donald Trump argued on Wednesday that a House committee's request to obtain 6 years of Trump's tax returns should be blocked, saying the effort is politically motivated. Some would portray this as them trying to hide Trump's tax records from the Treasury. A pipeline for traffickers who were running guns from the state of Georgia to the state of New York has been shut down by police. 9 people have been indicted so far, with a total of 6 arrested, including one that was unfortunately named Jamarl Thomas. I just spotted that, and if Jamarl were in studio, I would be like making a slight joke out of that, but he's not, so it's just a weird side insult or something. I don't know. Anyway, moving on here. In international news, Lebanon is facing its worst economic meltdowns in over a century. Since 2019, the Lebanese pound lost 90% of its value, and the annual inflation of the country was 84.9% in 2020. As a result, consumer goods have nearly quadrupled over the last 2 years, leaving the middle and lower classes unable to make ends meet. In Olympic news, just to give you the overall gold medal stats, so far the medal leaders in order are the United States, then China, Russian athletes, Great Britain, and Japan. China has the most gold medals with 33. The U.S. follows at 27. Then Japan is in last on this short little 3-part list with 19 gold medals. And in Earth and Science news, last month was the world's 3rd hottest July on record. This is only behind 2019 and 2016, with Finland and the U.S. heating up far more than usual. Researchers are attributing this to the increased greenhouse gases contributing to climate change. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And one quick thing here. Producer Austin, I'm going to put you on the spot. Can you please come into this room and sit in one of these chairs and keep me company? And occasionally, we might talk about the Olympics a little bit, but this will help. Thank you. One other headline I wanted to come back to briefly. Between the headline, it was in here yesterday. I put it in here yesterday about I believe it was Amnesty International that released this report on the state of Lebanon, where they were basically criticizing the government, which has since collapsed and is no longer functional. The then government of the country of Lebanon for their handling of this warehouse that exploded and like absolutely destroyed the city of Beirut. This was a warehouse that some people thought was a weird some sort of attack, but nevertheless has been sort of more or less officially around the world accepted as, okay, this was just an accident. There was a warehouse that was, at first it was reported that it was filled with firecrackers, and then it came out that there was this chemical that was being stored in large quantities called ammonium nitrate that acts as an accelerant, and some combination of the two. You have firecrackers that will go like light on fire, as is in their name, and then you'll have ammonium nitrate that will accelerate that fire quite rapidly, and the two being contained in such a small space basically used the shell of the building as the shell of a bomb, kind of. And this was right on the port in the city of Beirut, biggest city in Lebanon, and it just devastated not just the port, but like many surrounding houses, killed hundreds of people, injured thousands, destroyed a lot of the city's infrastructure. Anyway, my point is that happened to Lebanon last year, and they already had problems and in terms of protests and everything, and now they're absolutely crushed. They're reeling from that. So the fact that they're facing one of their worst economic meltdowns in over a century is honestly not that surprising. Extremely unfortunate and I think unprecedented set of events with the way the warehouse exploded. It's just I can't think of another event like that. A kind of accidental leveling of a part of a city. Anyway,
when I was writing that headline, it said that was one of the contributing factors because like it just kind of capped off the crisis of like, okay, now we're hitting the worst of the worst.
Yeah.
And they have not been able to recover, and supposedly there's no end in sight.
No. Well, and they had protests for years. They'd had a serious political crisis they were going through. All these problems economically. We've had guests on, but we'd had guests on before this happened, I believe. Where we were talking. The central bank manager was like apparently put in by outside forces and was screwing a lot of people over in the country. At least that was the narrative. So there's all this stuff that was already there, and this doesn't help.
There was actually a firsthand account. I don't remember which source I took the story from, but the firsthand account of a one parent household in Lebanon where it was just the mother and the child, and she was a security guard. Got laid off during this crisis, and she said how she remembered how on a security guard salary you could pay for AC, you could pay for your furniture, you could still put food on the table and be like comfortable enough back in like 10 years ago or more. And now, even with what her salary was, if she still had the job, she couldn't afford she could barely afford food and is selling furniture to pay rent. And she said, I think 2 days ago, her and her daughter sat down for a meal, only lit up because she can't pay for electricity, only lit up by a single cell phone light. That was handed out. The meal was handed out by their neighbors, and it was potato sandwiches.
Oh man,
just 2 pieces of bread and some potatoes.
That's brutal. That is terrible.
Yeah,
and that's so yeah. Economy really not doing well. What does that look like? In large part, that looks like inflation. It looks like goods costing a lot more, an undersupply of things that you need, which means they're going to cost a lot more. That's rough. Okay, one quick check-in on the Olympics, because this, we're almost to the end of it. In fact, from our perspective, we've got like effectively, including today, 3 more days of coverage of this guy. Thursday, Friday. The event ends this Sunday, and then we of course hit this Monday. Final wrap up. My point is, from the vantage point of the show, this thing is almost done. What's like, we can do the full retrospective after the fact, but I remember going into this, the creative director got fired in a couple of days before. Just like looking at it generally, it seemed like it could be a fiasco. It seemed like with the events right before, it's like this could really go bad really quickly. They fired the creative director right before.
Very experimental.
Yeah.
Because, no one's tried to do this before in the age of a pandemic. And it's already been delayed a year. So, they had to get it on. Tokyo already spent a ton of money to build up the infrastructure to host it. So they had to do it. And the case counts were rising since the athletes were there, but they already committed to it, so they had to do it. Yeah. And now all of a sudden there's a huge talk about should NBC get exclusive rights to stream this, when, see, our problem here in America, I'm sure a lot of you can sympathize with this, is that you go on Twitter, you'll see Simone Biles is out, or she leaves mid-competition. And you won't see that on the stream on live TV till 12 hours later. So you can see that wake up at 9 a.m. in the morning, but because you only get it on one channel, if you don't have the NBC app, you only get it streamed live on one channel, then you've got to wait until one event's done, two events, five, six events are done later in the day before it's live and you can see it. So the rest of the world's getting it. And the problem with that is, well, it's because NBC has sole rights, but they also have exclusive rights for the next, I think, 6 Olympics.
Oh, really?
Wow. Yeah, I think it was a $12 billion deal. And they have, it might not be as much as 6, but I know it's in the 2030s. So they've got the Olympics rights all the way up until the 2030s. So nothing's going to change for a while.
That's kind of screwed up. That's interesting. Well, this is also pretty close to another related conversation that I think you brought this up because you know about this. You told us about this, and I don't know that we've talked about this with you on the air. We might have tried to bring it up with the professor that we had on the media and propaganda stuff.
He's coming back tomorrow.
Awesome. That's great. I saw we were talking about that, but this question about cities and profiting from the Olympics and like it becoming a hot potato that cities don't necessarily actually want to take on because it costs too much for them. The Olympic Committee, International Olympic Committee, I believe, makes money, but cities don't at this point, and that's kind of shifted from where it used to be.
Right. So
the
way that, I mean, it has the way that the Olympics has been run. It was always seen as, oh, every country wants to host it. That's how it started, and that was true. Every country wanted to host it to prove that, like, to the rest of the world that we are developed, we are on the world stage with everyone else, and then they would get income because it really highlights the really beautiful parts or eccentric parts of the city. So I believe that happened in Spain when they hosted it. But ever since Canada hosted it, I believe at the dawn of the 21st century, or whenever Canada hosted it last, they severely went bankrupt, and I believe they just paid it off. Like, they went billions and billions of dollars into debt. And since then, because there was always this tradition of, okay, well, now we need to build up infrastructure. We need to build up all the stadiums. I mean, how many random track stadiums do you know, track and field stadiums do you know that can host an Olympic event in America?
Yeah.
Not many. I mean, we got football stadiums, but those can't be easily converted.
And they have to pay so much money. That's the main cost, right? Is building these facilities, especially that you would need. And
it's a one-time use.
They don't use them again. Exactly. They have to.
And then you've got to pay for keeping them up to date and renovated and for years and years, because you don't get the Olympics twice in a row. It's every 4 years. So maybe if you're lucky, you get it once, and then another country gets it, and you get it again.
But like, what does that do to what the Olympics are for? I'll put it like this: the Olympics as an international thing, the way I've seen them for a long time, and the way we first started talking about them before they started happening, World War II, 1936, this massive international Olympics that has intense geopolitical significance, and different sides are using. And so it's like, oh, that's one mental image. Okay, this is a sort of discourse between nations where they're like, you say it's prestige and showing each other, showing off in some sense. But if they're now having to pay a cost for it, and if it's like, here's a way of looking at it. If it's the International Olympic Committee, if it's that body that's making money, and okay, advertisers are pulling it in, those are the ones who are benefiting, basically. Well, what am I missing here? In other words, it seems like the actual point of it is shifted without anybody noticing, kind of.
So that whole dynamic of every city's been going bankrupt from hosting this, and countries have been going bankrupt from hosting this, changed when the U.S. got the Olympics in L.A., I believe in 2008. Whenever we hosted in L.A. last. And there's two reasons for that. One, we already had the infrastructure. We had everything built, and we were wealthy enough to have it pretty much just some renovations and stuff, and we're good. We didn't have to start from scratch again. And two, man, I wish my professor was here. He could talk about this. But the director for the Olympics in the U.S. sold everything. Everything went to sponsors. There was an official beer of the Olympics, but there was like the official chair of the Olympics. There was the official shoelace of the athlete, essentially. But he sold everything he could, and the Olympics made money for the city, and the streaming rights were paid off, and the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, made, so everyone came out on it ahead. So it basically set the precedent for, you need two things. You need, one, a developed nation that already has the infrastructure, and two, you got to give into ads. That's the only way that it's going to work, and a lot of countries don't have the infrastructure. So yeah, he's going to probably talk about this tomorrow, but there's been a lot of talk recently about, what about a permanent Olympic site? Every country contributes to it, and you have essentially the International Olympic Committee make sure the upkeep's there.
We'll get into it more tomorrow, but would that be like not international waters, but like A new Switzerland, that kind of thing. Where
Well,
it's like,
the problem with that is, I'm sure you've heard the stories of the runners that train in because they live in high altitude areas.
and they do better because they're
and they do
training.
way better when they go down to closer to sea level because their lungs are so used to operating on much less oxygen in their body with less oxygen in their blood, and then they get the influx of oxygen, and it's like they can perform a lot better.
Yeah.
If it's a permanent spot,
They can't do
some
that.
race of people are going to have an advantage and some are going to have a disadvantage.
Well, but that's true anywhere they host it, isn't it?
Right.
You're
But
always
that's the
setting a
beauty
sea
of it.
level.
It bounces every.
Oh, I see.
So it's not always an advantage and a disadvantage.
But wouldn't they always have that advantage? I don't want to get too deep onto some, one specific tangent, but it seems true to me. Wouldn't they always have that advantage? I mean, the people who are training in high altitude, if they train in a high altitude environment, and then the Olympics are in a high altitude environment, they have that advantage. If they train in a high altitude environment, and then the Olympics are at sea level, they have that advantage.
Yes, but it's not just high altitude and sea level. It's also East versus West Coast in America. It's like how heavy is the air? It's like a blanket on the East Coast.
Yeah, there's
So that
all these
that
different.
also, so there's always different factors and stuff that because it bounces all over, you're like, okay, yeah, maybe I need to train a little bit different, but maybe someone has an advantage this year, but next Olympics they won't. So that would be my.
That's interesting. Yeah, that could be a very interesting idea. I also wonder what you would do with, if you would have a need for it, like maintaining the buildings and infrastructure, and like what you would use it for when it's not being used by the Olympics, because that's every couple of years for a couple of months at most. Obviously the events are just a couple of weeks, but
Yeah, that's a good question.
I'm not sure.
And the biggest one actually is Winter Olympics. Winter Olympics is so much more expensive because there's way less sports. Apparently, there's overall less interest around the world, and it's hard to find a place that has that much snow.
Yeah.
Like most places have to create their own snow.
Yeah.
That is a major city that can actually host it. Not really.
Yeah. That's very interesting. And so the general picture here, like I asked, like, okay, how are the Olympics changing? It's expensive to host them, and for some reason, like, I wonder if it feels like it has a bit less prestige or something. It means a little bit less than it did 70, 80 years ago. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
I don't know. It wasn't live.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's one of those harder questions to ask. But I guess my point here before we close is the purpose of it's kind of changing. Like if you have one site, then instead of it being this thing that it's bringing the world together and it's constantly the locations bouncing around between different countries, and you have the baton that's handed off, the fiery baton, the torch that's handed off from person to person as they travel around the world. Admittedly, weird origins. We talked about the Nazi origins of that specific practice. But I guess my point is the way those seem to have been interpreted is like, okay, this is this thing, this around the world event, you know what I mean?
Well,
and if it moves to a specific site that never changes, that's in any given country or location, it's now just like an event, if that makes sense.
It's kind of like the same thing as you grow up thinking like, oh, you grow up believing American exceptionalism. You grow up believing the American dream is possible. But when you get older, you're like, well, how much of that is America pushing its own agenda? It's the same thing. Like the Olympics have been used as a political tool for a very long time, ever since the Nazis and before. They've been used to project power. They've been used to wage cold wars. So it's kind of like you grow up and you believe it is for just pure athleticism and competitiveness, but on like a good stage and not on war. But then you realize like all the implications, and then you have like doping scandals from countries, and it's just people don't play fair. And
so it almost sounds like it would be better from the athletics point of view, more purely about the athletics, if it were stripped of the geopolitical implications. Is almost where you're going. What'd you say?
Good luck doing that.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I don't
it's
see
not gonna
that
happen. Even this one, like I'm even guilty of it. This one, I'm like, come on, we have to go up against China. I mean, which is more important, golds or overall medals? Right now, we're way up in medals, and China's been way up in golds.
Yeah.
So we have to beat China this one. Why? Because the tensions are so high between the nations right now.
Yeah.
And it was Russia and the U.S. for a while. That was like the big hot competition.
Yes. No. And it's very interesting. And we could speculate on exactly why that is. It's just interesting. China was such a large population. You'd be like, okay, if everybody's equally talented and coaches are equally skilled at training people, and they're just going to win, right? It's going to be like China and India winning every time. But of course, that's not actually the case. There are wide differences in it. Ability and
when China wasn't, and I know a lot about this from my professor. talked a great class on it. But China was not always like a big world power, of course, and they did not come out with very good athletes. Like they were really just lower tier in the Olympics. And then they were making a huge push, like, no, we're going to be front center on the stage. We're going to be up there with the U.S. and the Soviets and all that in the USSR. And what they decided to do was, okay, well, we're not going to beat the Russians in weightlifting, and we're not going to beat the Nigerians or the Jamaicans in sprinting. So what we can do, because you can introduce, as you've seen with skateboarding and rock climbing this year, you can introduce new Olympics new sports, new events every Olympics. Mm-hmm. What we can do is introduce as many of the new ones as we can, and we're going to train our athletes to the most technical precision that we can. So we may not be the fastest and we may not be the strongest. And that's why it's still carried over. That's why in sports like ping pong, that's why in sports like men's gymnastics, where it's all about technique, China has always excelled. Mm-hmm. And they did that from essentially doing a Spartan training system of when the child is 8 years old, they go into technique training, and they've been doing that for a while. So, I mean, a lot of their medals are in really precise categories, and that's very interesting. How they tackle the Olympics.
That is very interesting.
Yeah.
And I wonder, like that kind of could inspire other conversations. Like, is there anything, and this almost would sound racist, but is there anything like Chinese about that way of doing things? In other words, is this as a sort of organizational managerial approach to doing things? Is this exemplary? Is this representative of how they do things in other areas? Or is this just their way of solving this specific problem? Does that make sense?
I think they saw the Olympics, as most countries do, as a way to project to the world how you're doing, how your country is doing. And when they wanted to say, no, we are now first world, like high power in the nation, in the world, first world nation, high power, then their way of doing that was to say, we're going to beat everyone in the Olympics, or we're going to try our best. And then everyone's going to have to they're forced to contend with us and lose.
Yeah, rising power status for sure.
Yeah, so that's how they decided to tackle it, and I mean, it worked.
Fantastic. Well, we'll see where that goes. Ultimately, of course, I'm rooting for the States. And again, just to give people the sort of context for this conversation, China is currently second in place behind the United States in overall medals, but they're 33 gold medals in front of the U.S. with 27.
I've been watching this every day, and literally China gets up to tying us. Like, I think 2 days ago, they tied us in overall medals. I was like, no, this is where they're going to jump ahead. And now we are up 87 total to 73 China. So we jumped 15 medals.
That's impressive. In which sports? Do you know? Like, what was it?
I was watching sprinting. I was watching men's 200 meter yesterday, where 4 U.S. sprinters were in there and 2 Canadian ones were. The Canada dude came out with the last legs and he won the race. And then 2, 3, and 4 were all U.S.
Yeah.
Easy, quick 2 medals.
Yeah.
If that Canadian wasn't there, we'd have a gold, a silver, and a bronze all in the same event. But, I mean, I think it's just because track and field is really kicking off. We don't see a lot of Chinese prominence in track and field.
Interesting. And we're talking about Jesse Owens. That's a long time ago, of course, but like bringing that up. Do we excel in track and field? Is that something that we're known for?
Yeah, we're fairly good at track and field.
Because I think of like the Russians just being good at gymnastics for some reason. I really don't know the lay of the land here. Please correct me.
The Chinese are very good.
Chinese are very good at gymnastics.
Chinese are very good at gymnastics. Russians are pretty good at gymnastics. They're probably 2 contenders for 1 or 3 with the U.S. Yeah. And it's pretty much like the way I see it. China's probably the best at gymnastics, the way that I see it, and then the U.S. and the Russians are right behind them, just always battling out between them. So it really is between those 3 really who can take it. Yeah. For track and field, mostly with sprinting and running, any long distance, look towards Nigeria and Jamaica. Like, those runners are crazy.
Yeah.
But you don't see a lot of Chinese runners that are doing those, winning.
Yeah, so. Yeah. Very interesting. So then I guess what are, like, Russia specifically?
Shot put,
really?
Strongmen,
really?
Yeah,
interesting.
Weightlifting, they will win in gymnastics all the time. So there's that. Hammer throw, yeah,
that's very interesting. And Canadians, I'm assuming hockey, right?
Yes.
Curling.
Yeah. Oh, also Russians really good at hockey.
Oh, yeah.
Really good.
Yes.
So, I mean, yes, Canadians are good at hockey, but I mean, it feels like the U.S. is a contender in a lot of the major sports. But also that also plays into the mindset of where we're coming from, because for us, we see the big sports as track and field, gymnastics, hockey, basketball. But that's because our countries place so much importance on them.
Yeah.
In China, everyone they stop schools to watch the ping pong championships, and I think there's like race walking is big in other countries as well. I'm not sure if you've seen it. It's pretty funny.
I have seen that.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. So the professor who comes on to talk about the Olympics, he's coming on tomorrow. He was a race walker in high school and college, set a couple records, and one of his buddies that he walks with went to the Olympics, and he could have gone, or he could have trained to go, but he injured himself. But it was really funny to see that.
It's kind of a truly bizarre one, because they can't have I think the main rule, right, is that they have to have at least one foot on the ground at all times.
Mm-hmm.
They can't take both feet off. In other words, if you're jogging, you'll sometimes do that.
Yes, but you also have to have, when you make ground contact, your leg has to be straight. So those two things contribute to the walking that looks like you got a wedgie.
Yes. Yeah.
And the hips swinging out.
Trying to maximize forward motion, basically. Yeah. You're using your range of motion.
It's interesting.
And then another side of this, we're going to close here in a minute. I've been pushing this because normally, of course, this segment is filled by Jamarl's monologue, and Jamarl is currently out of the studio. Another side of this, if different countries value different sports. So like you said, if China intensely values gymnastics or ping pong, which is the one that you brought up, and if Canadians and Russians value hockey, for instance, even if certain countries objectively do worse, so even if Russia's in 4th place, or the United Kingdom, which we haven't brought up in any of these lists, and is in 8th place, if they really value a specific sport, they can kind of come home feeling a sense of national pride and victory.
Yeah. Back home,
dominated
back
those
home,
ones.
they don't care about the ones that, the big sports for us are not the big sports for them. So for China, if they lose track and field, who cares?
Yeah.
Australia is all water sports. They've got great rowing teams, phenomenal swimming teams that always battle with the U.S. So if they win those, Australia's pretty happy.
Yeah.
Because they know that we're the best on the water, mate.
It sounds like they would be. Yeah. And they're, island nation. I mean, continental.
You got to swim to go to work.
Exactly. There you go. That's right. I'm going to close this out slightly early here. We will be coming back in a few minutes with Mark Frost, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, capitalist, recovering libertarian, Schumpeterian, much more. A lot of titles there. We'll get into that with Mark when we're coming back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I'll be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're talking about credit and debt, specifically business credit and debt. And this is an interesting conversation. I'm going to be bringing in our guest here. But this is at least two sides of this. One based on an article that Mark Frost, our guest, sent to me, and then another which is going to be tangentially, but I think directly related to this conversation. It's just an interesting side. It has to do with inequality, class inequality, debt, again, the huge amounts of loans that have been doled out during the pandemic, and businesses loading up on debt on this side of the pandemic, whatever that means, although we're still technically going through it. Without further ado, though, I want to bring out our guest, Mark Frost. He's an economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schumpeterian, and recovering libertarian. Mark, thank you for joining me again this week. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing pretty good, actually. I've had my cup of coffee. I played with the cat, so life is good.
Good to hear. And you know, as is often the case, I couldn't tell. Did you say cat or cats? Plural or singular?
Cats. I have 2 cats now. Yes.
There we go. Exactly. And one of those is fairly recent, I think you said, right?
Well, yeah, because I'm actually working on an academic paper right now, and I'm calling it Shutdown Cat.
Wait, what?
Time series, because everybody went and got cats during the shutdowns, and dogs, and
Interesting.
measuring, I'm measuring the significance of that by geography. Dogs have done worse than cats, probably because cats are more self-sufficient. But people went and got cute little kittens and puppies when they were lonely, and now that there's responsibility involved, they're either abandoning them or returning them. And so the charity that I volunteer with at the Humane Society, we're awash in cats right now, and it's adult cats, and they're the hardest to get adopted out. So that's sort of my little pet project I do on the side, is try to put cats into people's homes that will love them.
That's the scheme you're running, and it's a profitable scheme, I hear. You procure cats, distribute cats, and profit. I kid. Let's get into the actual main topic of conversation here. This is a super interesting one. You sent this to me. I'll give it to you right up front. We're going to be talking about the debt article that you sent me over
Yes.
with businesses taking out large amounts of debt. But I also wanted to get on this conversation that we were having kind of, behind the scenes here on Fault Lines about the PPP loans, all the money that people got from PPP loans in businesses in many cases, which didn't need that money, but were just getting it. Whether they're small businesses or big businesses, the same sort of rule applies here, or at least the same principle from my perspective, which is a lot of people who got money in this case probably didn't need it. And then a lot of people who needed money didn't get it, which means politically there's a big sort of problem here that I don't feel that we've actually resolved. And a lot of conversations about COVID, I think, should have to do with the economic implications of it, how it affects different ways of looking at this, not just the GDP, but also inequality. And if rich people or people who are business owners and therefore probably already fairly well-to-do in some ways, if they're getting a lot of money, and people who are being prevented from going into work or facing onerous and rising prices due to inflation, if those people are not getting the money, you hear what I'm saying. So I'm giving you the heads up on that. I want to get into that conversation too on those loans. But what's the deal with this, Mark? Which businesses are we talking about? How much money are they getting? You said you were pretty worried about this. Why are you worried about this, and what's actually happening? Who's getting how much here, Mark?
Well, sure. It just has to do with the concept of opportunity costs, and that when you flood a particular sector with money, they're going to do something with it. If somebody just handed me $100 million, I wouldn't go spend it all. I would do something with that, and one could predict what I might want to go do. I think I was on this program approximately, if I get my months right, about 15 months ago, and I was somewhat critical of the Paycheck Protection Program. And I think I said something like, this sounds to me like another crackhead Bob phobia. Because where they needed to get the money to was the restaurant workers and the business workers, because businesses, and I'm not saying there weren't certain businesses that might be targeted, but even at that time, businesses were floating in capital. We did not have a capital problem in this country, and we haven't had one throughout this entire pandemic. And it seems to me that the common denominator of all of these government stimulus programs is, at all costs, we have to keep crackhead Bob from getting $1. And for new listeners or people that aren't associated with me, I use crackhead Bob as a straw man for any dollar that goes to someone that maybe in retrospect shouldn't have got it. And it's the equivalent of, swallowing an elephant and choking on a gnat, because the amount of money that is improperly allocated throughout these programs that goes direct to individuals pales into comparison to what we're going to find out is improperly allocated to businesses and to different places. Here in Georgia, if you're everybody's right now, I was just watching Fox News, and they were talking about the eviction problem, and they're scratching their heads and, well, I don't know, where's all the money going? It's, $48 billion has been appropriated. Well, I can tell you where it's going. It's like a big plumbing maze, and there's all these bottlenecks because what the federal government should have done is made direct grants to tenants. But of course, maybe 0.5% of crackhead Bobs would get some money, so you couldn't do that. So they made these block grants to the states. Different states do different things. Here in Georgia, they don't even do it by state. They do it by county. In the county I live in, they outsourced it to a ministry. Must Ministries allocates the rent protection program here in Georgia. And it requires a bunch of paperwork. First of all, the landlord has to participate in it. Maybe the landlord doesn't want to participate in it, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And then secondly, you have to prove certain things. You have to have a formal written lease. Well, about 20% of the way things are rented here are just handshake leases. People rent a room. People rent a garage apartment or something like that. And the government is so paranoid that someone that shouldn't get it in their mind will get it. In statistics, we call this a type 1 error. They're terrified that they're going to give somebody $1 of welfare that doesn't deserve it. And it drives me crazy because the amount of money that's actually gone directly to individuals, although significant, pales in comparison to the amount of money that's gone to stimulate businesses, state governments, municipal governments, and all that sort of a thing.
Well, but there's also, it seems like there's another alternative here because, okay, so what you were saying is if the federal government basically gave direct grants to renters, in this eviction moratorium situation where it is ended, and so individual states and judges and people are basically having to sort of either individually protest against this or push for change pretty quickly on a federal level. Anyway, that's the situation. You're saying the problem is the federal government didn't give those grants directly. They gave it to states who, in some cases are bungling this pretty badly. In fact, in a lot of cases are bungling this pretty badly. But if the federal government did some basic means testing, wouldn't that solve a lot of the problem? It's just that you're asking the federal government to do something, and they will often want to hand this down to the states so that they don't have to worry about it anymore. That kind of thing, right?
Well, yes, because I'm an economist, not a politician, but my guess is that it was easier to get it passed because now they don't have to worry about the details. They can just say, well, we did what we could. We gave $48 billion to solve this problem. Well, they gave it to a state. Now the states don't know what to do with it, so they gave it to the counties. In my particular county, at least, they didn't know what to do with it, and so they gave it to a ministry. The ministry is the one that is – it would be like I wanted to help you personally, but I was worried that you wouldn't do it right, so I gave the money to Jamal. And I said, okay, this money is – for Shane, but I'm going to give it to Jamal. And then Jamal gave it to his cousin, who gave it to his cousin. And then, maybe it gets to you. They threw in such a bottleneck of bureaucracy that it makes the whole program a Saturday Night Live skit, as far as I'm concerned.
Now, Mark,
people that are really hurting bad are not getting the money.
Having said all that, why are you a recovering libertarian? That doesn't sound good for government.
I can tell you why, because the libertarian movement has been taken over by the anarcho-capitalists, people who are literally...
Yes.
They are rubbing their hands right now because in their mind, finally, I want to do them justice. They're feeling, not thinking, but they're feeling, thank God, the whole thing's about to implode. We're finally going to get the anarcho-capitalist dream world. The label I would like to use that actually describes myself is liberal. But as Joseph Schumpeter said, whether by intended or accidental compliment, the enemies of the system of free enterprise have seen fit to appropriate its label. And so liberal now means something different. But the word liberal means government should govern liberally. Government should show why something should be illegal, not the people have to show why it should be legal. So that's my background, and that's why I don't want to be associated with libertarianism anymore.
I hear you, and the anarcho-capitalistic strain is strong certainly, and I know some. And there's, like as with libertarianism more broadly, there's like an ideological purity to it, where the axioms that you follow and the way that things follow from the basic assumptions is fairly simple and logical and easy to follow to various conclusions, even though those conclusions are sometimes morally repugnant in various ways, whatever. At least it kind of makes sense. Not saying it's right, but I think you know what I mean. There's a logic to it that you can follow. I want to come.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I want to come back to the businesses and the taking out of large amounts of credit here, because the other side of this is they're going to be spending that. This is the kind of thing that the Fed wants, right? Why is this? You're looking at this apprehensively. Why do you think this is going to go poorly? And what do you think the Fed might not see, or the various managers, maybe not the Fed, might not see in this happening?
Well, I refuse to believe that the people in charge or the power players in this, the Fed, the Treasury, are idiots. They have to understand what's likely to happen here. And from my initial measurements, it is happening. These companies are taking essentially free money, because when you factor in the inflation rate, their borrowing rate, it's actually negative rates for them. It's rational for a company that is connected to prime credit markets to borrow. Now, what would you do if you were the treasurer of a company or the chief financial officer and you had negative rate money? You would start buying back your own stock, right?
Yeah.
You're going to do something with that money. Now, what the Fed hopes they do, just like in 2008, the Fed hoped and prayed to God that the banks wouldn't sit on the money in a fit of risk aversion. They hoped and prayed that they would loan it out. They were wrong. The banks sat on it in a fit of risk aversion. And what they're doing right now is they're hoping and praying that these businesses will open up new factories, will hire people, et cetera, and things like that. What I suspect they're going to do with it is they're going to buy back their own stock. They're going to invest in AI and robotics, and they're going to look at ways to shore up their supply chain so they get out of what scares them to death, the labor market, which finally has some market power right now, because a lot of people have said, you know what, I've got a taste of a different life, and I'm going to look at opportunities to do something different.
The problem with that, Mark, is, or at least that way of looking at things, is that sounds like that would create a lot more crackhead Bobs if situations aren't taken care of appropriately.
Well, what creates crackhead Bobs is the war on drugs. If there was no war on drugs, there wouldn't be any crackhead Bobs. I mean, in the literal sense.
Yes, in the literal sense. But yes, yeah.
Straw man sense, you're always going to have crackhead Bobs. If you have a mass distribution system, for instance, if you distribute masks and make everybody wear them, you're still going to have X% of the people who wear them on their chin. So you have to factor that into whatever model that you're building, whether it's a formal model in mathematics or it's a model in your head. You have to factor in the leakages of an idealistically produced system. And I don't believe politicians are generally idiots. I mean, I just can't believe that. They have to know, if you pass a blanket law and just put money into the states, that the states are going to struggle with how to get it to people, because they have their own local political issues that they have to deal with. Because I know in Georgia, and I know it was true in Texas, and I think we talked about it last time I was on the show when we were talking about Max Weber. There is a notion in this country, certainly in the South, of rugged individualism, that any kind of help from the government makes you a less virtuous, more immoral person. It's why so many southern states have opted out of the PUA program, which extended unemployment benefits even to people who were gig workers and things like that. So in a lot of states, that money has already dried up. And in a lot of states, you don't have the same legal framework around evictions, because there's two ways an employer excuse me, there's two ways that a landlord can get you to move out. They can formally evict you, or they can make your life miserable. Electricity just happens to go out every other day. Things like that. And it's much easier to be that kind of landlord in the South than it is, say, San Francisco or New York City, something like that. They have the opposite problem. That pendulum seems to be shifted the other way.
The renters have too many rights or something? That's almost... Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah. I mean, there are cases of a person like you that has a 4-unit, you have a 4-unit apartment building, and you have to keep maintaining. So if the air conditioner goes out, you have to replace the air conditioner, but you're not getting any rent from the people, and you haven't for 8 months.
Yeah.
Yet the county and the state and the city still want their taxes, and you still have to maintain the property. And so yeah, that's a problem. I don't have any intention whatsoever of vilifying landlords. Landlords are due their rent. And if you have any other opinion of that, you ought to just go join the Communist Party, because that's the concept of capitalism is we own property and we get to do things with our property. And one of the things we get to do is we get to rent them out via a contract in law.
It's true, but at a certain point, this becomes I've played enough games and I've simply lived enough life to know that at a certain point, if there are victors, and it might be a premature use of the word because I'm not talking about the end of the game or whatever, the end of the situation, but if there are people who have a lead, whether it's a first move and they get that advantage or they just build it up over time, if you have a monopoly, if you have a small number of people who are increasingly accruing more and more power and shutting the rest of the population out of it, or effectively keeping them on a kind of life support or whatever. There are different ways of looking at the situation, but surely that has to be remedied politically, right?
No, I don't think necessarily. I think that most things that need to be remedied are remedied by the market itself. Intergenerational poverty is a great example. I can't tell you how many people I know, being a professor, how many people I know who show up at school and their parents were dirt poor, and their parents sacrificed so that their children could have better lives than they had. That's something that can be empirically verified. Now, government sometimes, in its effort to help, actually ends up hindering. Government help can be a straitjacket, and this is why I'm very picky about how government helps. We have this habit in this country that if you're poor, you're necessarily morally bankrupt. I don't believe that, because I've been really, really poor myself. If you want to help somebody, write them a check. It's a great way to do it. Yes, a tiny percent will go buy crack with it or go spend it unwisely. We'll always have our prodigal sons. There's no getting around that. But that's not the point. The point is, if as a society, as a republic, if we make a value choice that we want to help people who are financially hurting, then the best way to do that is to get out of the bureaucracy and write them a check. They will go in turn make the best choices for them that they rationally can conceive of. But we don't like the choices that they make quite often. The left doesn't like their choices. The right doesn't like their choices, because there's this self-righteousness that we have when we hand out help that you have to spend it a certain way. I'm not going to tell somebody who is given $1,000 a month of welfare that they don't need to go spend $50 of it on a bag of weed. Maybe that's exactly what they need to do at that particular moment in their life. Maybe that self-medication keeps them alive, keeps them sane, and keeps them thinking about the future. I don't know. But what I do know is the politicians don't know. And the best person to know that is the person whose life it is. Just because we help somebody doesn't mean they lose the status of having a life of their own. A great book by David Kelly, by the way, A Life of One's Own.
Interesting. And I agree with that. That's the strain of libertarianism that I can agree with completely. I'm going to take us to a break here, but at the same time, I can agree with, the individual people are often noble, and that's not where you were going. They're self-aware, first and foremost, but they're often, I don't know, they're not noble and helpful, and they don't have to be forced to help other people. That's, anybody who's lived in a functional enough community sees that happening more and more frequently as it gets more functional, basically. Just people doing each other kindnesses for no other reason than to do them a kindness effectively. So that happens. But at the same time, again, there is this concern, inequality gets too extreme. You have a smaller and smaller number of people, families even, who own more and more. And that is itself a hindrance. It's a kind of bottleneck on economic growth. Again, if you're not if you looked at it from a command and control economic perspective, which probably isn't the best lens, you can mobilize so many more people to do so many more things with their lives, start businesses, learn new skills, those kinds of things that theoretically they would be systematically deprived of if a few people were benefiting from owning everything, which again, it's a bit of a hyperbolic scenario, but we have enough time to follow it up. We're joined by Mark Frost, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schumpeterian, and recovering libertarian, also friend of the show. We'll be back with Mark on the other side of this short break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and I continue to be joined by Mark Frost, economist, professor, capitalist, Schumpeterian, and recovering libertarian. Mark, thanks again for sticking with us. I'm going to switch topics slightly here. China. I don't actually know that we've talked about China. We've talked about Russia a couple of times. We've talked about trade broadly speaking, but you've sent me a couple of messages, and this is, it'll probably be a little bit of a debate or something, but we'll see where it goes. China, I think the way that you see them, the way that you've painted them as our main sort of geopolitical competitor at this point, specifically our main economic competitor in the world, you've described them as the fascist nation, not communist, not capitalist, misunderstood, fascist. That's the principal label that should be applied to them from your perspective. Now, I think I see where you're coming from, but I wouldn't go that far. But I first want to allow you to make your case. Mark, am I right there? And if either way, how do you see them? How would you describe them? And why is it a relevant label? Why is it a relevant distinction? Mark.
I would not think poorly of you if you disagreed with me, nor would I dig my heels in the sand on that statement. I just think that the words capitalism, fascism, communism, and socialism are so poorly used, certainly in the mainstream media, that they've almost taken the power out of the words to mean anything. So let's just real quickly, capitalism is very easy. It's generally speaking, the individual ownership of the means of production, private ownership of the means of production. A great test for a capitalist nation is there a functioning stock market? I like Mises's definition. If you need a litmus test, do they have a functioning stock market that's relatively free? And if the answer is yes, they're a capitalist country. Norway is a capitalist country, even though they have high levels of government support. But they also pay for those high levels of government support with the appropriate level of taxation. So they're a capitalist country. So a communist country is a country that is dedicated, at least theoretically, to equality of wealth, of outcomes, and all of that. Theoretically, a communist nation would have a Gini coefficient of 0. That means perfect inequality. A Gini coefficient of 1 would be perfect inequality. One person has all the wealth. So, generally speaking, in functioning, healthy economies, we want that somewhere in the middle. You want some Jeff Bezoses, you want some crackhead Bobs, but you don't want too many of each. That sort of a thing. And then fascism is a hybrid. People forget that fascism wasn't a dirty word in the 30s. I believe it was 1937, Mussolini, who was really the inaugurator of it, not ideologically, but certainly in practice. He was Time Magazine's Man of the Year. And it literally means the third way. It's neither communist nor is it capitalist. you have some aspects of the private means of production, but the state, on an authoritarian basis, has so much control over it that they can override anything that a private business would expect. And there's no division between the self-interest of a business and the self-interest of a country. And so what you end up having is sort of a command and control type of an economy. And the stock market itself, even if they have one, probably isn't well functioning because the state has its fingers on an authoritarian basis in the economy so much. So in a fascist economy, you're going to have a person like Albert Speer, for instance. You're going to have a ministry of economics that isn't just about, okay, what's the optimal tax rate, but it's going to be, should we produce left shoes or right shoes, this month? What should be produced and that sort of a thing. And the concept of fascism is businesses should not make profits for selfish reasons. They should do so for the welfare of the state because the state represents the people. And so there's similarities of fascism with communism, and there's certainly some similarities of fascism with capitalism. And so China has stock markets. One could argue whether they're functioning or not, whether they've crossed the line of being a free market within that stock market, but they certainly have functional stock markets.
They do, but they also rein in companies and will, undercut them in ways that reduce their stock prices and their stock valuation. And, could be, I don't know if that's market manipulation exactly, but it seems like in a lot of cases, the intent is to manipulate the market. And I don't even mean that as like, ooh, they're guilty of committing a crime. I just mean, it seems like that's their goal, is to keep a fairly firm hand on the reins when it comes to, how successful individual companies are, what they're allowed to do, what their latitude is for action. But I think where this goes wrong with people, you use the word fascism, and technically, yes, the union of communism and capitalism, that for a long time was my sort of technical baseline definition of fascism. And so I've used that myself. But I also have to remind myself, there are other things. There's the ethnic side of it, which when many people think of fascism, they of course think of ethnic nationalism. I wouldn't say that that's true with China and the Han Chinese. It's, a little bit more controversial, but it's not like they believe they are a super race or they believe they are a supreme race, or it seems even that they believe that, I guess it gets a little bit murky. It doesn't seem like they believe that it should be a primarily Han ethno-state, although I've heard people saying that it approaches that level.
But that was German fascism.
That's my point, but that's what I'm saying. I don't know that China is actually there, but I hear you. There are ways in which they kind of approach it. There is also, in German fascism specifically, but this can be applied to the Italians too, there's a kind of like mysticism, and whether it's a pagan mysticism or even an atheistic mysticism, there's this weird, if you look at the foundational texts and writings, there's a weird like Western mystical tradition thing that you're probably aware of. A lot of people are. And you can see this coming to the surface in the fascination with the occult that the Nazis had, but the fascists had it, broadly speaking. China has a completely distinct sort of ideological heritage, right? What's your take? We got to close here pretty quickly, but briefly, what's your take on that brief pushback, Mark?
Well, on that trip that I spoke of several appearances ago, when I took a train and ground transportation only from London to Singapore, I cut China right in half. I went straight down from Beijing all the way straight down to Vietnam, Cambodia, Singapore, all that. So I visited the China that very few, even journalists, have seen. And I'll stick to my guns that China today has morphed into some significant form of a fascist country, and they've combined their ancient pre-communist heritage with the People's Revolution lore, and they've mixed in several ounces of capitalism with it, and they have produced a system that I think is best described as by fascism. And
that's the thing. I hear it. I will accept your use of it. You know what I mean? Not that it's mine to accept, but we're out of time. I wanted to hit on that because I don't know that I don't think we talked about that before. We're out of time now. Mark Frost, economist, professor, consultant, entrepreneur, recovering libertarian. Mark, thanks as always for joining us. We've got to go to a break for this hour. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another hour, another two specifically, of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan, and currently not sitting in the opposite corner, we have the indefatigable progressive political analyst, Jamarl Thomas. And together, that means you are almost certainly, in fact, you are certainly listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. I hope everybody's having a wonderful morning so far. To give people a reminder and a heads up, it's Thursday, August 5th, and here on the East Coast, it's just past 8 a.m. Eastern in the morning. Speaking with Mark Frost last hour. Later on this hour, we're going to be speaking with Scott Ritter. And then at 9 o'clock, we're at 9:15 to 9:45, we're going to be speaking with Professor Richard Wolff, economics professor. With Scott Ritter, we're going to be talking about the situation in Iran, the kind of constant, ballistic skirmishes over the Persian Gulf, which basically my take here is every month or two, and sometimes more often than that, you'll have ships getting downed or ships getting hit, and often these attacks will be blamed on Iran. Sometimes they'll be blamed on Israel, other forces in the region. My point is, this keeps happening, and it's just an interesting phenomenon that's deadly and dangerous and violent, but also happens so regularly that in a weird way, I'll get into headlines in a second, but in a weird way on an international scale, it kind of reminds me of these shootings that happen constantly in the United States, where because it happens so regularly, you kind of forget that it's happening. You get desensitized to it, but it's this is a big deal. And in the same way that we're sometimes reminded of a shooting or of police abuses in the States because they're particularly egregious, well, sometimes maybe we'll be reminded of this. And I'm curious about how that's used geopolitically, if that's a sort of tool in the waiting, if that's an arrow in somebody's quiver that they're going to try to pull out, that these attacks are happening, what that looks like. Anyway, that's with Scott Ritter. With Richard Wolff, we're going to be having a conversation about China, trade, economic policy, propaganda, rhetoric, different sides of this. But without further ado, let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, there are about 112,270 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday. There are also about 725 new deaths from yesterday. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 96,036 cases per day. That's an increase of 131% from the average 2 weeks earlier. That number just keeps going up, by the way. The number of new cases on average consistently rising. I said the 131% number. That's a little bit more confusing because we've had 100+% increases for weeks now, which if you know nothing else about the number that I'm talking about here, you'd be like, okay, then that's a consistent linear increase, right? In other words, if you're looking at it on a chart, it's just kind of moving in a straight line upwards. It's just consistently going at the same rate, but no. That's not how this works because this is, it's multiplying. You're effectively more than doubling something. So every couple of weeks, it's more than doubling the size of the number that came before it. So it's not linear. No, it looks a lot more exponential if you look at it on a graph. It has kind of that hockey stick look, which means it's getting worse rapidly, and I understand why authorities are struggling to contain it. 50% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated at this point. 58% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 35,438,000 people across the United States. It's also killed just under 615,000 of us. The Biden administration has said it is planning on putting in place entrance restrictions to the United States, requiring that visitors be vaccinated before arriving. This would come as a tool for reopening travel from other countries. In national news, if you live in the northeast region of D.C., do not drink the tap water without boiling it first. D.C. Water was working on a main line in northwest Washington, D.C. yesterday, and they believe that bacteria could have entered the system within the hour that they were working on the line. Many of the valves were shut off. Northeast is now under a boil advisory for water to be used in cooking, drinking, brushing teeth, and more similar uses. The advisory is expected to last until this weekend, specifically Saturday. And if you live in the area or nearby and you get symptoms such as diarrhea, cramps, nausea, or headaches, well, if those symptoms continue, you should call a doctor. This is your heads up. Lawyers for former President Donald Trump argued on Wednesday that a House committee's request to obtain 6 years of Trump's tax returns should be blocked. Some are saying that the effort, they're saying that the effort is politically motivated. Some would say this is Trump's effort to hide his tax returns from the Treasury, which, if he's guilty of committing a crime and they're looking into it, he shouldn't do that. But of course, if it's politically motivated, which I don't think anybody can deny that it is, then, there's some pushback from the other side. Anyway, President Biden is expected to sign an order today aiming for half of all new vehicles to be electric by the year 2030. Biden will be joined in the White House by Ford and GM executives and leaders of the United Auto Workers. While this act is largely symbolic, Biden is hoping for a public buy-in by the major car manufacturers in the country. Interesting, I'll put it like this, it's less than a decade away. That's a kind of fast turnaround time for supply chains, which are long and, they're mammoths. It takes a long time to turn those ships around. But it's not too fast. This also comes as a lot of different car companies in the U.S. are adapting. At least that was the sense I was getting. I'm not looking for cars right now, but it seemed like a lot of the car manufacturers were adapting to electric vehicles, shifting those over. So, maybe this will accelerate that slightly. I guess my point was we were already moving in that direction. A pipeline for traffickers who were running guns from the state of Georgia to the state of New York has been shut down by police. 9 people have been indicted so far. A total of 6 have been arrested, including one who was unfortunately named Jamarl Thomas, not Jamarl Thomas. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis stated yesterday that he would stand in the way of any federal COVID-19 restrictions that would hurt Floridian businesses or take away residents' rights. This is in direct response to Biden's remarks on DeSantis, where he stated that the governor needed to, quote-unquote, get out of the way for people trying to fight the recent case numbers surge. In international news, Lebanon is facing its worst economic meltdowns in over a century. Since 2019, the Lebanese pound lost 90% of its value, and the annual inflation of the country was 84.9% in 2020. As a result, consumer goods have nearly quadrupled over the last 2 years, leaving the middle and lower classes unable to make ends meet. Interestingly enough, Austin and I had a short conversation about this earlier, where he was talking to me about a story of people basically completely unable to procure food for themselves, who are, unable to get electricity, unable to get money for rent, basically only able to afford food on a salary that would have fed them, housed them, kept them reasonably comfortable because of this huge downturn. And so he was describing people having to eat by the light of a cell phone after being gifted potato sandwiches by their neighbors. Not a good picture. And again, this is due to the at least in part, due to the massive warehouse blast at the port of Beirut last year. In Olympic news, the U.S. women's soccer team won bronze in their 4-3 win over Australia. They're going to be coming home with a medal after losing to Canada in order to go to the gold game. Kevin Durant, however, was able to send the U.S. to the gold medal game in their game against Australia. I'm going to ask for somebody to come in and explain this one to me, because it's slightly confusing, to me at least. So far, to give you a picture of the Olympics overall, the medal leaders in order are the United States, then China, Russian athletes, then Great Britain, and Japan. China has the most gold medals with 33. The U.S. follows at 29, then Japan with 21. Earlier, I said that the United Kingdom was not on this list, but I'm an idiot there. They're in 4th place. I was using them as an example, and I forgot that they were actually one of the names I just read. My mistake. Anyway, those are our headlines. Oh, with one more, actually. Earth and Science news. Last month was the world's 3rd hottest July on record. This is only behind 2019 and 2016, both within the last 5 years, with Finland and the U.S. heating up far more than usual. Researchers are attributing this to the increased greenhouse gases contributing to climate change. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And I'm joined now in the studio by producer Cordell Woodland. Cordell, how How are you doing this morning?
Not bad. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on it. I think this is the first time we've been in the same room this morning.
Yeah.
we will often, we're you got the control room next door. We have this glass panel, and so we see each other, and so it's like, okay, we're in the same place. But I just realized, no, there's this weird divide thing suiting COVID. Anyway, we're talking about this U.S. women's soccer team winning against Australia. I thought,
well, that was basketball.
Basketball. I thought we were disqualified. Where am I getting confused here, Rodo?
Well, the women's team they just won bronze. The women's soccer team. The men's team is now in the gold medal game, and it's that game, I believe, is going to be this weekend. But yeah, the men's team has pretty much been dominating ever since they lost their early exhibition games, and everybody was in a panic frenzy, and they've settled down drastically, and Kevin Durant is showing that he's possibly the best scorer in the world.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so I realized my mistake. I'm an idiot. It was bronze. They weren't able to compete for the gold medal.
Right.
For some reason, I thought that they'd either won the gold or something. I don't know exactly what mistake I was making, but anyway, they couldn't compete for gold. They got pushed out. Canada, I believe, beat them out, right?
Yeah, Canada.
Canada pushed them into this lower spot, and they competed and won the bronze medal in this case.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to an earlier question. Thank you for joining me in the studio, Cordell. I'm going to keep you here for a few minutes. Go back to a question I asked with Austin. We had a much longer conversation. This will be quite a bit shorter. Just like looking at the Olympics overall, how they've we were supposed to have them last year. This has kind of been a long time coming. People have been stuck in their houses. This is the kind of big entertainment event that, like people look forward to for years. Right. And then it got delayed. And then, being stuck in your house, if you're the kind of person who's looking forward to this, it's like, man, I just can't wait for it to happen. I can see somebody who, if they're passionate about it or if it's their life, whether they're an athlete or not. My point is this has been delayed and now it's actually happened. But there were also all these problems leading up to it. And yet it seems like it's been going mostly well from the outside.
Yeah, once the Olympics actually got going, it was more so about the purity of the events. It got to actually being about the sports themselves. And, with the drama with the creative director getting fired the day before opening night and everything, and everything leading up to it. And we did have some drama, Simone Biles backing out of the gymnastics routines and everything. There was some drama there, but all in all, I think everybody's expectations were blown away. We thought it was going to be a catastrophe for a little bit, and really it's turned out to be a pretty good event all in all if we're talking about just the events themselves. There's been some good stories, some good feel-good stories that we love to see from the Olympics from all sorts of different countries. So I would say to this point, the Olympics have been a success.
That's good to hear. And that seems it seems 100% like the case. But again, it's weird just because of everything that was leading into it. And with the creative director, we didn't even mention Sha'Carri Richardson,
right?
Who dropped out, of course, and was pushed out. I say dropped out. Yeah. It was because she tested positive for weed. So that happened before. But there's I don't know if this is a scandal exactly, but this whole PC thing. I don't know if I was out yesterday, so I don't know if you guys talked about this, but Jamarl wanted to talk about it. This Bill Maher clip, where Bill Maher, nighttime host and comedian, he's talking about how the Olympics have gone PC, and I think he's talking Simone Biles. I think he's talking the creative director getting fired for anti-Semitic jokes that he'd made 2+ decades ago. Mm-hmm. There are these different sides of it. Do you see any of that, or do you think that's being overplayed? What's your take?
To think that we're going to get an event like the Olympics to not be any type of political at all is just unreasonable. Yeah. It's unreasonable. They're going to be sensitive. It's just what's going to happen. This is a global event. And so they have to cross every T and dot every I. They can't, and I can respect it. I may not agree 100% with people being reprimanded for things that they may have done or said years ago. But at the same time, I understand they have a brand to protect, and this is the pinnacle of events worldwide. All the countries come together, so you have to be on it for that. So I can understand that. Really, this Olympics, for me at least, the major difference has been the coverage. The coverage has been really unique. And some people I'm not even going to say some people like. I don't know anybody that's really been glowing about the coverage of the event.
What are you talking about?
This year?
What do you
Just
mean?
the way that they've covered it. That a lot of the sports, the basketball, for example, basketball is a very big popular sport in this country and even globally. But most of the games are pretty much on Peacock. I believe all of the basketball games have been being broadcasted on Peacock.
We're
NBC's
talking about this
app.
earlier. Yeah, exactly. So NBC has this monopoly. I know, my brother and I live together. We get this TV at home, and Peacock's been advertising to us. NBC really has been advertising Peacock and service to us, trying to get us. And I even tried to join because I was like, I want to watch this stuff. I want to watch it in real time. That'd be cool. But it was a hassle to join, so I dropped out midway through the process. That was my brief experience. But Austin was telling me when he was in the studio earlier that people have been complaining about this. This is a problem. They have a monopoly. They're the only one with the rights, and it's delayed because of that.
The coverage has been trash.
Yeah,
the coverage has just been trash. And really, unless you're on Twitter all day and keeping up to date with everything that's going on, you're really going to be left behind in a lot of things because you're going to find out so late if you're relying strictly on NBC. Now, thankfully for me, I've had Peacock for a while because I'm an avid Office fan, so I got it for that. But if I didn't, I would be upset because basketball is one of the few events that I actually make an effort to watch when it comes to the Olympics, and to have to basically be limited to watching it on the Peacock stream, that's a little upsetting.
It's good for them, but it also, in a weird way, it's kind of bad for them because if people are pissed off about not being able to watch it other than through them, well, who are they going to blame for that? Peacock. That's the thing they're thinking of.
Right.
And so I don't know, especially because it seems to have become a thing. You're more into this stuff than I am, and so you'd be more aware if people are pissed about this or irritated about it. It sounds like they are, and it sounds like therefore NBC is going to have to deal with that. Anyway, we're going to go into a break. Cadell Woodland, producer for Fault Lines, thank you for joining me.
Yep,
Good short conversation. We're going into our break, coming back with Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector. We're going to be talking about the situation in the Persian Gulf, and partly the timely news story about Naftali Bennett, current Israeli prime minister, what he had to say about getting the U.S. involved in its situation with Iran here. But we're also going to be talking about the situation more generally, this ballistic skirmishing that's going on with Iran and these other countries in the region, specifically Israel, what that would lead to, how worrying it actually is. It's just weird to me. But we'll be talking to Scott about that. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Just me in right now, though, except we have Scott Ritter on the line. Jamarl Thomas is out of the studio, but we have our guest, Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and a weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. Follow Scott on Twitter at @RealScottRitter. Scott, thank you for joining me this morning. Really appreciate it. How are you doing?
Doing great, thanks. Yourself?
Good. Better for having you. Thank you for being with me here. Let's get into it. Like I said, as I was setting this up, the news from late last week, over the weekend, I believe, Iran, it is claimed, hit a tanker, an Israeli tanker specifically. Israel, specifically Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, has said that Israel would respond. More recently, they've said they would do so without needing the help of the United States. Just briefly, because I also want to get into this conversation about what I'm referring to as ballistic skirmishes, which is a weird way to put it, but basically every month or two, these strikes in and around the Persian Gulf on these ships passing through these contentious waters, what that looks like, what's causing it, what it could lead to, that larger conversation, because this is just a specific example of that larger conversation. But on this instance, Scott, what set this up? Why do you think this happened, and what are the facts here?
Well, I mean, we know. I mean, Israel has all but admitted that it's been waging a covert war of attrition against Iranian shipping, in particular targeting Iranian oil tankers that are delivering oil to Syria in violation of Western sanctions, and in a manner that the Israelis believe is propping up, the entire axis of resistance aspect of Syria. So Israel has been engaged in this conflict. They have a commando unit that's operating out of the Red Sea. This commando unit has become very adept at closing with Iranian ships and attaching limpet mines, these magnetic mines that stick to the side, and punching holes in the ships. Iran's not stupid. They understand what's going on, and they've retaliated on occasion by taking similarly covert action to strike Israeli-owned ships. It's very rare. In fact, I don't think they've hit an Israeli flagged ship yet, because I don't think there's too many of those operating in the Persian Gulf. But Israel does own a number of ships which are flagged on other nations, and Iran has retaliated. And I think this latest incident is a case of Iran covertly. It's deniable. They say they aren't doing it. I don't believe them, because Iran's doing this, but it's not that they're doing it to provoke Israel. They're doing it in retaliation to what Israel's been doing to them. Iran's not going to sit back and allow itself to become a punching bag for the state of Israel. There will be consequences for actions, but Iran's done a good job of keeping this very low key, meaning it is a kind for a kind. If Israel taps an Iranian tanker, Iran's going to tap an Israeli flagged ship. There's no escalation here. Notably, neither side seeks to sink a ship, and they've gone out of their ways to avoid, taking human life. Unfortunately, I think over the course of the dozens of attacks that take place, a couple sailors have died. But this isn't about sinking a ship or killing people. This is about harassing, creating a situation where, for instance, in the case of Iran, it'll become prohibitively expensive for them to insure their ships, and Israel has to deal with the same thing. If Israeli-owned ships are being targeted, the insurance companies are going to put prices through the roof. So that's what's going on here. Now, Israel's promised retaliation. The United States, Great Britain, and others have indicated that they would be sympathetic to this. But Iran has put a marker down. They said, if you get too carried away, we can shut down the Strait of Hormuz in an instant. The Strait of Hormuz, of course, being that critical, vital choke point in the Persian Gulf, where the vast majority of the Middle Eastern oil flows through. And if Iran shuts that down, it pretty much chokes off the global economy. And the United States, for decades, has said we guarantee that the continued access of this oil through the Strait of Hormuz. We can no longer guarantee that. It's pretty much guaranteed that not only will Iran be able to shut it down, but they'll be able to prevent the United States from reopening it in a timely fashion. So I think Iran has put a warning out there for Israel and for the Western powers that if you want to keep playing this tit-for-tat, tanker-for-tanker game, we'll do this all day long. But if you seek to escalate, then we will take the ultimate sanction, which will be to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, and it ain't going to open up anytime soon. It'll strangle the global economy, destroy the Middle Eastern economy, and put the United States in an extremely difficult position of having to do something it's not ready to do, which is go to war with Iran.
That makes sense. And I want to come back to how you see Bennett and Israel responding here. But briefly, is this as old as the Syrian war on the general phenomenon of the Persian Gulf interactions and altercations with hitting the ships, basically, like you're saying. Again, not usually with the intent to sink them or capsize them or anything like that, but to hassle and to, again, whether it's insurance prices or the cost of repairs or just this looming latent threat, just generally to harass them. Is that as old or as young as the Syrian war? Does this predate that? Does this specific, sort of set of interactions? Because I'll put it like this: I'm a relatively young guy and a neophyte with some of this stuff, and for as long as I've been paying attention, which has all been under the all been post-Syrian war in this period, where it's still ongoing. Is it as new as this, or is it as old? Is it older than it, Scott?
Well, I mean, Israel and Iran have been, playing a covert game of harassment, so to speak. But the tanker aspect of this, it postdates the Syrian conflict. It's directly related to, oil equals revenue, revenue equals capability. And, Israel has been trying for some time now to starve out the Syrian government, to degrade the presence of Hezbollah, the pro-Iranian militias, even the Iranian Quds Force inside Syria. And so by targeting Iranian tankers that are delivering oil to Syria, that's parcel of Israeli policy, which works hand in glove with U.S. policy to strangle the axis of resistance, so to speak. So this aspect of the tanker aspect of it is something that's more recent.
That makes sense. That makes perfect sense. Thanks for that. And then coming back to it, how do you see Bennett responding? Naftali Bennett, Israel's prime minister, you said that the United States would be reticent to be drawn into any outright armed conflict on land. Bennett, do you see him being so reticent? And how do you think, just briefly, how do you think Netanyahu would have responded? In other words, taking the difference between previous leadership and current leadership, how do you think Bennett will respond? And would Netanyahu have done any different, Scott?
I don't believe there's any difference between Bennett and Netanyahu when it comes to this, because this isn't about the prime minister. This is about reality. A prime minister can bluster all he wants to, pound the table, throw things at people, yell, scream, point at a map, gesticulate, whatever he wants to do. At the end of the day, an Israeli general is going to come up to him and tell him that, we can start something here that we won't be able to control the finish or the outcome. That's just the end of the day. Israel learned a very hard lesson in 2006. In 2006, Israel thought that it would be able to go into Lebanon and slap Hezbollah around with little or no consequence. What they learned is that Hezbollah was a much more difficult opponent, and that it was Hezbollah that slapped Israel around. And Israel came out of that looking very bad. It actually empowered Hezbollah and indeed all Arab or resistance forces in the region, who suddenly woke up to the fact that Israel is not invincible. 2006 was a walk in the park compared to what will happen next. Hezbollah's weaponry has advanced by orders of magnitude. They have long-range missiles, precision strike missiles. They have tunnels that will allow them to infiltrate in a matter of hours hundreds, if not thousands, of fighters into northern Israel. The Israeli military fully expects in any future conflict with Hezbollah to have Israeli towns captured by Hezbollah, meaning Israel will lose territory, and that Israel will be in a very difficult situation of having to recapture towns held by Hezbollah. This is not a battle any Israeli prime minister wants to get involved in. And if he pushes it beyond Hezbollah, Iran has its own missile capabilities that can rain death and destruction down on Israel. So Bennett, and remember, Netanyahu beforehand was always railing against Iran, but he never pulled the trigger for the big one because he knew what the consequences would be. He always had an Israeli general whispering in his ear saying, we don't want this fight because we cannot guarantee the outcome. Israel does not like to enter into any military event unless it can guarantee an outcome. And with Iran, with Hezbollah, they can't. So Bennett will say things. He'll look for a way of retaliating. There will be retaliation, but it will be done in a way that's quasi-deniable. It'll be obvious who did it, but it won't be, so obvious that Iran will be compelled to react. And that's what I see happening here. The danger here is that it's a gradual war of escalation. At some point in time, somebody's going to cross a line that's going to trigger a larger escalation. I believe that somebody will eventually be Israel. At some point in time, they're going to do something, whether it's blow up an Iranian facility, kill, a critical Iranian figure, and it's going to prompt an Iranian response, especially now that Iran has a new president who is a much more hardline president, who is aligned with a hardline conservative parliament, who is in line with the supreme leader. We now have the three major elements of the Iranian government working in concert with one another. And while they're not warmongers, while they're not beating the drum of war, it will be far easier for the Iranian government to act decisively, today than it was when you had a moderate government under Rouhani who was seeking some sort of rapprochement with the West, who might have put on the brakes, slow down the work of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and other elements. You don't have that today. So Israel may seek to act in a way from a playbook that may have been effective under Rouhani.
Yeah. Anticipating a response, anticipating a more muted response from Rouhani, and then it would be misplaced. They wouldn't have that sort of tempering them, the knowledge that Raisi would respond differently. And again, in power for just a couple of days. So technically maybe they don't have that much evidence to go on in terms of how he would respond. But from everything he said, you're right. He's more of a hardliner, and he would push back critically and swiftly. That makes perfect sense. I want to take it to a break here. When we come back, I think I want to pick this back up and keep on talking about Raisi for just a couple of minutes, talking about the new leadership in Iran, what that looks like and how that'll affect the region. There's this larger conversation we actually got into outside the studio here with Garland Nixon, host of another show, Jamarl and I. We were talking about China, and there's this conversation about the leadership of the United States, the mentality, ideologically. Whether we would budge or if we're all cold warriors when it comes to geopolitical interactions with rising powers, rising foes, like how much evidence it would take to change our strategy when it comes to China. I want to get into that conversation with you, Scott. We're going to be coming back with our guest, Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking with Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and a weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. We're talking about Iran, the recent strike on the tanker in the Persian Gulf, the escalation between Iran and Israel, which has so far been muted. It's so far, there have been these skirmishes with Israel effectively putting out mines, damaging Iranian ships, Iran reciprocating in a lot of cases with drone strikes and limited missile strikes. that has been happening. And so we were getting into this conversation about Israel, which has been used to a Rouhani-led government having to adapt to a now Raisi-led government. Ibrahim Raisi, the current president of Iran for just a couple of days, since August 3rd, 2 days ago. And I wanted to come back with Scott, our guest, getting into this conversation about what else a Raisi government would look like, not just from Israel's perspective, but what else the West might see from them, the United States, but also China and Russia. In other words, this new leadership of Iran, which is in a weird, I wouldn't call them a kingmaker necessarily, but they play clearly a pivotal role. They're a sizable country with a sizable military, and, they're standing at odds with a lot of their neighbors. They're an important player, is my point. How are other countries going to react to Raisi's leadership, and what's that leadership going to look like? Scott, I'm just going to pass it right over to you. Main takeaways here. What's your take?
I think, a lot of people have been, we've grown accustomed to, 8 years of Rouhani leadership, which has ties that go back to, the leadership of Khatami, another moderate. And during this time, we saw an Iran that was struggling in terms of, what its strategic path could be. And a lot of people said it's a struggle between continuing to try and reconcile with the West, or a pivot to the East, meaning to China and Russia. And indeed, that's because many of the players that were formulating foreign policy for Iran were articulating just that. But what that ignores is the position of the conservatives and the hardliners, who are not fans of either reconciling with the West or pivoting to the East. These are people who believe in Iran's inherent ability and duty to stand up on its own 2 feet. And I think the government of Raisi is that kind of government. They're not going to, of course, turn their back on China or Russia, because they can't afford to turn their back on China or Russia when standing up to the West. But I think the days of any attempt at a Western reconciliation, it's over. Iran will try and get the United States to come back into the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, for the only reason to get sanctions lifted. But Iran will not be working with the United States or Europe. Both the United States and Europe have destroyed their reputation as negotiators, as people that can be trusted, especially the United States. But Iran isn't going to, prostrate itself to China either. Yes, they may open the door. There might be some Chinese investment, but I don't think you're going to see Iran going full tilt toward China or Russia. I think Iran's going to be Iran. They're in a very powerful position right now, geopolitically, in the region. The axis of resistance that Iran has been able to construct in response to, the actions of the United States, Israel, and others, is a very powerful axis. Right.
Let's pause on that for a second, please. We have Syria, we have Hezbollah in Lebanon, you have Hamas, you have Iran. Anybody I'm leaving out there?
Well, you have the Houthi in Yemen.
Thank you.
You have the fact that Iraq has a pro-Iranian Shia in place.
Absolutely. Okay, so that is it. I just wanted to remind people that's what it looks like. That's exactly who we're talking about. In a few cases, nation states, specifically Syria, the Syrian government, and Iran. But in a lot of these cases, proxy groups or political parties in other countries, that's what the axis of resistance looks like. Now, coming back to this, will China and Russia, for that matter, will they tolerate this? Because, again, Iran right now is a regional power. It is not anywhere close to a global power. It's not a major power in the same sense that the European Union as a bloc is, or the United States is and has been, was maybe. You get my point. Will China tolerate Iran trying to maintain its independence? Or will Russia tolerate that for that matter? And if they choose not to, what do you think that conflict might look like? How long do you think that might take to happen? Or do you think they'll be mostly Pacific with it? China, mostly okay with just the Belt and Road and infrastructure building program, investment packages, that whole thing. Will that be enough for them in your opinion, Scott?
Well, first of all, I don't think either China or Russia have the same kind of desire to assert regional hegemony over the region like the United States does. Iran right now is useful to both China and Russia as sort of a brick wall upon which the United States is just bashing its head against. And so long as the United States continues to bash its head against the Iranian brick wall, I don't think the Russians and the Chinese are going to do anything to change this. I do believe that they have an interest in keeping the Iranian nuclear program in check, that they don't want this to spin out of control. They also don't want Iran to revert back to its early 1980s mode of exporting Islamic revolution. So they'll keep that in check. But that's not what's happening with the axis of resistance. It's not the exporting of Islamic revolution. It's literally empowering Shia populations to stand up and defend themselves against oppression from Sunni governments and Israel and the West. So right now, I think both Russia and China are comfortable with this. They're not going to align themselves with Iran per se, but for instance, take a look at Syria. Russia is on the side of Iran when it comes to Syria. They're not all in saying Iran can pour troops into Syria, but both Russia and Iran are working together to keep the Syrian government in place. In fact, Russia came to Syria in a large part because of the intervention of Iran, who sent Qasem Soleimani to Moscow to meet with the Russians to talk about bringing the Russian military in on the side of Syria. So,
and that's the late Qasem Soleimani. Again, most folks listening will probably know that, but Iranian general assassinated, kickstarting 2020, by the way, at the beginning of last year. The U.S. killed, effectively.
We murdered him. That's what we do.
Yeah. Scott, I'm going to pivot. We've only got maybe four or so minutes left with you. I want to pivot to take the most advantage of our time. Thank you again for being with me this morning. Talking China, we kind of pivoted naturally to them already. I got into this conversation. Jamarl and I were standing outside the studio here, and Garland Nixon came up early for his show, pre-records, I think, something. Anyway, we got into this conversation about China, and we're talking China is escalating their rhetoric. I'll put it like that. They're making their rhetoric a little bit more bellicose. You could see that in the meeting earlier this year in Alaska, where between Blinken and two counterparts, one more aggressive, one less, they basically stood toe-to-toe with us, treating us as peers, effectively, asking to be treated as the same, and we didn't learn that lesson. Now, fast-forwarding a bit, you see more harsh rhetoric recently. The conversation that we got into outside the studio that was interesting to me was, is the United States going to see that? Is the United States an adaptive enough? Are the people in the Pentagon specifically, or the people in the State Department, are they adaptive enough thinkers to update to this reality in a reasonable time period? Or are we going to get a fiery conflagration as what's now an economic war turns into a hot war sometime in the next decade or two? Now, I'm sure a lot of people looking at the situation wonder about this. I don't know that we've actually talked about this one with you, Scott. We've mostly talked about the Middle East, of course, but facing China oriented in that direction, what are the chances that the United States would change its tune? How likely do you think it is? How do you think they should change their tune? I'm throwing a lot at you there, Scott, but what's your take?
Well, I mean, first of all, the United States is dealing with a Chinese reality that if you've been a Chinese watcher, you would have been you've been seeing this from a mile off. But we ignored the Pacific for the longest period of time. It wasn't until President Obama said he's going to pivot back to the Pacific and start focusing on trade relations, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was negotiated by Obama, but then withdrawn by Trump and didn't replace it with anything. So we left with this giant vacuum that China moved into. They put in place their own international trade agreement, the largest in the world. They're dominating the region economically. And we also, because of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, allowed our military presence in the Pacific to wither to nothing. And China has filled that vacuum. So today we're confronting China with an economy that's just not up to speed. I mean, we're bringing Pop Warner into an NFL football game, and we're going to get beat. And it's the same with our military. We're just not ready to go toe-to-toe with China in a conventional conflict. And the Pentagon knows this. So I think you see a bunch of people, again, talking tough, but at the end of the day, they know they can't push China too far because if China decides to stand firm, we're basically we don't have the wherewithal to guarantee the outcome of any conflict with China. And the United States cannot afford to get into a shooting war with a peer nation like China and lose.
And a cold dash of water to the face it often helps to wake up. And that seems like that would be a cold dash of water in terms of internal messaging, how we'd respond to that. And it's good to hear you saying that because I genuinely wasn't sure. I'm still not, of course, but and we won't see until it actually happens. But if the Pentagon's wise, then hopefully they would advise the State Department, which you'd assume would be a bit more diplomatic about all this. What do you think a new policy towards China would look like if you had a modified position? What would the camps? I don't want I don't want to ask too much of you in terms of prognostication here. But how do you think this is going to go? How would we adapt our policy towards China after Trump and Biden and probably the next president, whoever they are, after there's this escalatory process? How would we draw that back, adapt it to this reality once we become fully aware of it? Scott, what do you think that looks like?
Well, I think the big thing is we will continue, we'll play on our strengths. And right now our strength is our presence in South Korea and Japan. So that's going to be our anchor in the Pacific. We are going to have to adapt to a new economic reality where we're no longer calling the shots. We will be an economic influencer, not a economic superpower. China is the superpower, and that's a reality that we're going to have to adapt to. China's economy and the way they position themselves in the Pacific is such that we can't compete anytime soon. So that's that. And the other thing that we're going to have to draw back on, and it's not just with China, but it's also with Russia, is this notion of freedom of navigation. We've been doing this for some time now. It was a big weapon during the Cold War to sail the most powerful navy in the world anywhere we wanted to because no one really could do anything about it. Today, China can do something about it and is prepared to do something about it, as is Russia off the in the Black Sea. So I think you're going to see the United States scaling back its freedom of navigation confrontations because again, we can't afford to get in a fight that we can't guarantee the outcome, and we will lose a lot of ships, and China will still be entrenched in the South China Sea. So I think you're going to see a gradual de-escalation from freedom of navigation, a revamping of our economic approach to where we are competing with China as opposed to trying to dominate China in the region, and then trying to shore up the big anchor we have in the region, which is, of course, our continued relationship with South Korea and Japan.
That is optimistic, and I'm going to feed on that because that, and I don't want to paint it too much, but we've covered in the Middle East and in the South China Sea, and broadly just taking China generally, situation with Taiwan included. We've covered those two. I would add Ukraine in. The situation in Ukraine, those are like the three main flashpoints around the world that I could see escalating into some sort of world war, to some sort of global conflagration. Now, China, it sounds like you're mostly optimistic on. We will adapt, basically. Israel, coming back to the Middle East, they could make a mistake. The situation in Ukraine, it doesn't, things heated up for a little while earlier this year, but it seems to have mostly slowed down. It seems like, the exercise has stopped. United States wouldn't pitch itself into it. In other words, in at least two out of these three conflicts that would become the flashpoints, it doesn't seem like they will. Do you agree with me there, Scott? And if so, what's your doomsday clock looking like? Because with those sort of out of the way, the threat of world war doesn't seem quite as pressing, or quite as likely, I mean. Scott, what's your take on that?
Well, first of all, I agree. Ukraine is just self-destructing in its own right. So is Georgia. I mean, these two nations that we said, oh, we want them to join NATO. They just can't get their act together. They will never join NATO. They will never join the EU. We will never have to worry about this. And again, it's just a self-regulating problem. Russia can mobilize 100,000 troops within a matter of days on Ukraine's border. It would take us 8 months to mobilize 30,000 troops to respond to Ukraine. So, again, the Pentagon is the voice of reason here, where they say, slow down, don't let our mouth write checks we can't cash. The problem is that we have a nuclear posture. I agree with you from a standpoint of a conventional trigger. These flashpoints aren't as dangerous as maybe they once were thought to be. The problem, though, is that we have a nuclear posture which is totally out of whack with this conventional reality. One would think that if you don't have conventional flashpoints ready to explode, that we could have our nuclear forces on sort of a permanent stand down, no targeting. We can, reduce alert status, things of that nature. It's just the opposite. Our nuclear forces are at Cold War levels of readiness. And all it takes is one misperception, one, mistake. Somebody launches a test rocket that gets misconstrued as a regular rocket, and then we got an issue. And that's the danger, is that we can have something that nobody would expect. We can wake up tomorrow and say, hey, things have calmed down in Ukraine, things are calming down in the Pacific, things are calming down there, and yet the world just ended because we weren't smart enough to tone down our nuclear readiness posture.
But wait, are we actually at that point? Is it, because I know that we have the armament, certainly, in terms of the technology available at hand, that could happen. But do you think that the level of emotion, the heatedness or whatever, the degree of paranoia is at that point right now, Scott?
Absolutely. When the United States deploys a low-yield nuclear warhead on Trident submarine-launched ballistic missiles on board a Trident submarine that we position in the northern Atlantic, targeting Russian forces, and we have an exercise where the Secretary of Defense actually practices pushing the button, launching that missile against Russian forces. The Russians say, we got to take that threat seriously. So they, in turn, alter their force posture. So, yeah, we have forward-leaning nuclear arsenals that are out of whack with the reality of the world we live in. And that is probably the greatest danger to humanity that exists today. It's far greater than global warming, which is a reality. It's far greater than COVID, which is a reality. I'm not trying to diminish these, but neither one of those will end life as we know it tomorrow. And yet one mistake, one hiccup, and we can see nuclear weapons flying in both directions. That to me is the most dangerous part of the world we live, the aspect of the world we live in today, is uncontrolled nuclear postures that are that are configured in a way that appears to be more in line with Cold War thinking at the height of the greatest moment of tension in the Cold War, as opposed to today, when, as we discussed, it's a difficult world, but there's no imminent flashpoint that creates an existential threat to the United States worthy of nuclear intervention.
Scott, real quick, we've got maybe 7 minutes left in this hour, and we actually have a caller who called in with a question for you. We didn't ask you this before I invited you on. Would you be willing to stick with me for the next 6-7 minutes, just to the top of the hour, take some calls, keep talking?
Sure.
Thank you for that. And with that, 202-521-1320 is the phone number if you want to talk to Scott. He's on. Now's your best chance. We have Tarif calling in from New Orleans with a question for Scott, I hear. Tarif, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Thanks for taking my call. Thank you, Mr. Scott Ritter, for staying on for the last 6 minutes. First, I'd like to say free Joint Science, free Derringer, and hands off Haiti. 3 questions. Please explain about the first question. Please explain about the war games that took place last year in October of 2020. The second question is dealing with hypersonic missiles. I just saw something that China is working on a second hypersonic missile that have a ramjet. They already have another hypersonic missile that's a glide vehicle. My third question is dealing with using Elon Musk rocket ships to deliver supplies halfway around the world for our troops, but it could be looked at as a nuclear threat because you don't know what's the payload on those ships coming in.
That last one sounds, I kind of want to start with the last one, but I'll hand it right over to you, Scott. Tarif, thank you for the call. That last one sounds unlikely to me. But Scott, what's your take?
Well, to deal with the last one, that actually has been something that the United States has been looking at for decades. When I was coming in the military in the 1980s, there were articles in various military journals about transporting troops using rockets, where you could get a commando force instantly deployed just pretty much anywhere in the world. Back then, the technology didn't exist. Today, it's still a little bit lacking, but I think it's well within the realm of feasibility to have a Delta Force strike team loaded onto a rocket and then 45 minutes later arriving at some point in the Middle East. It's technologically feasible. But as the gentleman raised the point, when you launch that, how do you convince the Russians and the Chinese you just didn't launch a surprise nuclear attack?
Some kind of ICBM or something like that. I mean,
right.
Yeah, you know so much more about this stuff. I would hope that they would be able to okay, this is the signature, this is the heat signature or the electromagnetic signature. You know what I mean? Basically taking
is that, but you still trust me when you're sitting in the command center and you get the notice infrared alert, missile launch, trajectory heading in your direction.
That puts a thing in your mind.
That's a pucker factor, yeah.
Yeah, I hear you on that. Okay, so he had two other questions. I took them down. We can go back in reverse order, I suppose. Again, this is taken from Tarif's call. The hypersonic missiles, and this, again, we were talking about the MAX air show a few weeks back with Russia. He was bringing up China as well. Just, I suppose, your thoughts on the hypersonic race in general and how that affects war.
Well, the thing about the hypersonic race is that it basically is a first of all, you need to understand that when I fire a ballistic missile, the warhead is entering at the hypersonic speed. So it's not like these missiles. In many cases, what we call a hypersonic missile is actually flying at rates slower than the trajectory of a ballistic missile warhead. The difference is that what we're calling hypersonic warheads, these change trajectory, and that frustrates ballistic missile defenses. And that's the sole purpose of this, is to be able to deploy a weapon system in a manner that cannot be tracked by existing ballistic missile defense systems, and as such nullifies them. And China has long warned the United States not to deploy ballistic missile systems in South Korea, in Japan, or nowadays we're modifying the anti-ballistic missile or the anti-missiles capability of ships, of Aegis-class destroyers and cruisers, so that they become sort of mobile ABM platforms. And so China is developing new categories of weapons that are designed to defeat ballistic missile capability, ballistic missile defense capability.
And the hypersonic part, this is something that's new to me that is very interesting. We've been talking about this, and clearly hypersonic, it's faster than the speed of sound. We think in terms of speed, but what you're saying, it's the unpredictability of it. It's that you can launch it, and then at a certain point, it sounds like it can change its own trajectory.
Yeah, it's not predictable. Normally, when you're shooting down a ballistic missile, it's flying in a parabola. It's the ballistic trajectory. It goes up, it comes down on an arc.
Yeah,
predictable. Radar picks it here, it can predict where it's going to come, and it fires a missile designed to intercept it at that point. But with a hypersonic, they tend to accelerate very fast, and then when they get to a certain point, instead of going in this ballistic trajectory, they flatten out, and they'll shoot in a straight line, and you just can't intercept them.
I see. Very, very interesting. Okay, then last, we've only got a little bit for it, but he asked about it. War games in October of 2020 last year. What were those? I think he just wanted a general explanation. Scott?
Well, that one has me scratching my head. I'm sure if I had more information, it would trigger something, but I'm of the age right now. Brain dumps data, and
No, fair enough. We didn't hit you up on that one, and I'm not sure what he's talking about. It sounds familiar, but we've got to come back to that, Tarif. Scott Ritter, thank you for joining me this morning. Thank you for sticking with us so long, particularly. Great conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you for being with me. Scott Ritter is a former UN weapons inspector and a weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. You can follow Scott on Twitter at @RealScottRitter. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Going into a break, we'll be coming back with headlines and the last hour of this morning show. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and the increasingly divided, embattled, fragmented surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan, and in the other independent corner, in the left corner, I should say, you have the indefatigable Jamarl Thomas, normally hosting this show with me, not in this morning, sadly. And together, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And again, it's a wonderful morning. Good morning, everybody. It is Thursday, August 5th. It's just past 9 a.m. Eastern. And it's decent weather this week in D.C., although there are problems with the water supply that I'll be getting into in a couple of minutes, and that put me in the mind of late-stage civilization, that we have deep problems and things are only getting worse. But I hope we can make a recovery. Let's get into the headlines, though. First up, in COVID numbers, there are about 111,270 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday. There were also about 725 new deaths yesterday. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 96,000 cases per day. That's an increase of 131% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 50% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated at this point, and 58% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 35,438,000 people across the United States and killed 614,800 people in the U.S. The Biden administration has said it is planning on putting in place entrance restrictions to the United States, specifically requiring that visitors be vaccinated before arriving. This would come as a tool for reopening travel from other countries. The Biden admin has come under some pressure for not reopening travel from other countries, which, would be good for tourism, good for the economy in a couple of ways, but would also drive rising COVID cases, especially if people are coming from countries with COVID problems. And, well, we have our own COVID problems right now. The Delta variant's been hitting the world, and it's been hitting us. And for good reason, I suppose they don't want to let people come and visit the United States, or at least until they're vaccinated, which is the headline here. In national news, if you live in the northeast region of D.C., do not drink the tap water without boiling it first. D.C. Water was working on a main line in northwest D.C. yesterday. They believe bacteria could have entered the system within the hour that many of the valves were shut off. Northeast D.C. is under a boil advisory for water used in cooking, drinking, brushing teeth, and more. The advisory is expected to last until Saturday. Look out for symptoms of diarrhea, cramps, nausea, and headaches. If those symptoms appear and persist, you should call a doctor. Lawyers for former President Donald Trump argued yesterday that a House committee's request to obtain 6 years of Trump's tax returns should be blocked. They said the effort is politically motivated, and some say that they are trying to hide his tax records from the Treasury and from the House. President Biden is expected to sign an order today aiming for half of all new vehicles to be electric by 2030. This is aspirational. It's a largely symbolic act. But he's hoping for a public buy-in by major car manufacturers in the country. And this comes as he will be joined in the White House by Ford and GM executives today, also leaders of the United Auto Workers. A pipeline for traffickers running guns from the state of Georgia to the state of New York has been shut down by police. 9 people have been indicted so far. A total of 6 were arrested. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis stated yesterday that he would stand in the way, quote unquote, of any federal COVID-19 restrictions that would hurt Floridian businesses or take away residents' rights. This is in direct response to Biden's remarks on Ron DeSantis, where he stated that the governor needed to, quote, get out of the way, end quote, for people trying to fight the recent case numbers surge. In international news, Lebanon is facing its worst economic meltdowns in over a century. Since 2019, the Lebanese pound lost 90% of its value, and the annual inflation of the country was 84.9% in 2020. That's an almost halving of the value of the Lebanese pound. As a result, more than that. As a result, consumer goods have nearly quadrupled over the last 2 years, leaving the middle and lower classes unable to make ends meet. In Olympic news, the U.S. women's soccer team won bronze in their 4-3 win over Australia, coming home with the medal after losing to Canada in order to go to the gold game. Kevin Durant, however, was able to send the U.S. to the gold medal game in their match against Australia. With France beating out Slovenia mere minutes ago, the U.S. will face the team they lost against in prelims to decide the gold. That's in basketball there. So far, the medal leaders in order are the United States, then China, Russian athletes, Great Britain, and Japan. China has the most gold medals with 33. The U.S. is following at 29. Then Japan is currently in third place with 21. In Earth and Science news, last month was the world's third hottest July on record. This is only behind 2019 and 2016. Finland and the U.S. are heating up far more than usual. Researchers are attributing to this to the increased greenhouse gases contributing to climate change. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Although, again, Jamarl Thomas not in with me right now this morning. I'm going to ask producer Austin Pelly, I'm sorry, I'm putting you on the spot again, man, to come in and sit with me here. Again, Jamarl's out of the studio right now. Hope he's feeling well. And joining me intermittently, specifically in headline segments, first up I had Austin. This was at about 7 o'clock this morning. Then Cordell joined me for a few at 8 a.m. Austin, bringing him back in now to keep me company in here until we get guests on. Austin Pelly, producer for the show. Thank you for joining me. How are you doing?
Oh,
there we go. Now you're on. How are you doing?
Good. You're getting really good at the cold call.
The cold call?
At the cold call.
What's that?
I'm going to cold call you into the studio.
Oh, yes. And Austin, you coming right in. It's, well, yeah, there we go. I'm actually, okay, well, real quick. I wanted to change subjects from the Olympics, which, you know, just what we were talking about earlier. Anything that I got wrong or anything that you want to add in on that?
I was a little slow to the Olympic update, but yeah, the gold medal count, it's not 33 for China anymore. They just went up 134. The U.S. had just got a couple non-golds, so now that divide between China is even greater. And Japan also got another gold, so they're at 22.
Interesting. Okay. And the divide that you're talking about, like we talked about this briefly earlier, this is the United States has more medals overall than China.
Yes.
But China has more gold medals than the United States.
And the rest of the world.
And the rest of the world. And both of those like gaps have increased. So we're each doing better in our own weird way.
During the last hour, the U.S. went up another gold, so it's the same distance.
I see with the gold one. Okay, fair enough. All right. I wanted to get into something completely different, which is our COVID response. We could talk about Cuomo. I was out of the studio when we were doing a lot of that coverage. I appeared on Garland and Lamar Leon's show. We talked about that briefly. I know that Jamarl had some people on. We could talk about that, but I wanted to talk about COVID actually for a second because we're in a kind of weird situation right now, and I wanted to get your take on what's going on. I was talking to my brother about stuff yesterday, and my brother's a smart dude. He follows the news. He listens to my show, and he, watches his own other news, of course. And at the same time, he's like, I don't understand what's going on here.
With what exactly?
With the everything that's happening right now with COVID. So we all get vaccinated, right? Or at least a lot of people get vaccinated. Then you have new variants constantly coming out. The Delta variant, we're told, is a lot worse, and we see it happening, or at least you see the numbers if you pay attention to them going up, like case count specifically, and now deaths are rising pretty dramatically, actually. Anyway, Then the mask mandate gets put back into place. Then you have like New York City coming out and requiring that people be vaccinated. I guess from his perspective, in DC now, in order to enter grocery stores, you need to put a mask back on. And for a little while there, you didn't. And if you remember, like before July, Biden, in the whole messaging thing, Fauci had to come in and be like, no, actually. Biden and a lot of other people were saying, if you get vaccinated, guess what? We can open back up. The lockdowns end. You can take off the mask. Society gets back to normal. Everything will be hallelujah, right? That was the messaging. And then Fauci kind of came in quickly and said, no, you still might need to wear masks. We were kind of hitting him on that in the show because a lot of the point of like a lot of the draw of getting a vaccine is you can be free again. You know what I mean? My point is there's been this mixed messaging over the last couple of months. And I can't blame my brother for being like legit confused about, wait, what's going on here?
I don't know if it's mixed messaging. I think that a lot of people weren't taking the virus as serious as they should have. And a lot of what's going on now is what, frankly, a lot of lefties wanted, but they were kind of scared to admit it. They were scared to administer it because it was like pretty much restricting a lot of freedoms. Like now that we have to re-implement masks, and now that we're doing like a full-on, you can't enter the U.S. unless you've been vaccinated, and like things are really starting to and requiring like QR codes or proof of vaccination status. These are all things that the right has been very adamant we don't want to do, and only after the second wave of like, okay, we tried it your way, giving in. And I'm on the right, but I think the right overall mishandled this, and it takes strong, decisive action in order to overcome the pandemic. And we didn't have that. We were more like dipping our toes in the water. We needed to dive right in.
Yeah.
So I know people weren't going to like it, but I don't like being in lockdown for a year even more.
Yeah. I don't like that either. There's also this, I don't know, there's this other side of it. This, you know, if you're somebody on the right or just somebody in general who, whatever, I'm trying to put myself in somebody else's shoes for a second and saying this isn't how I feel. It's one thing after another. It's okay. So we're going to be locked down for a week, which if you remember when this started, it was like, we're going to be locked down for a couple of weeks. I was looking at that saying that's crazy. That's not going to work. It's going to be completely counterproductive. That's a foolish move. That was the original messaging though. We're going to lock down for a couple of weeks. Then we're going to lock down for a couple of months. Masks are bad for you. No, wait. Masks are good for you. The Democrats at first, vaccines are terrible. I mean, pardon me. They were saying basically these vaccines are too experimental. They're being rushed. Trump is trying to get this out to save his election. But we can't trust them. You shouldn't take them, and it's a failure. That was their position then. Now you need to get them, or else you can't go out to eat. You can't do anything. It's like flip-flop after flip-flop. At no point in those flip-flops, as far as I can tell, has there been a clear, comprehensive explanation of like, okay, this was why we said that then, this is why we say this now. And lacking that, it just feels like you're being lied to, and like they're perpetually, you know, taunting you with a carrot and beating you with a stick while they try to get you to move where they want you to move.
It's just super political. And by nature, it was, because if the pandemic didn't happen, I think Trump would have won re-election. And so the Democrats saw it as a way of like, oh, we can finally get him out. And so then they took up their side, and then in response, the right took up their side. And then it just became no matter whose side or no matter what side we are actually on, as long as we're competing views, then we're good.
Yes.
Because then we both have a camp, because pretty much the country is going to be 50-50. Actually, I don't think so. I think if it was totally unpoliticized, I think it'd be like 80% in favor of vaccines, 80% in favor of, okay, let's deal with this in the short term now so we don't have to deal with long-term consequences, and 20% of like, I'm not going to take that. Like anti-vaxxers way before it was popular to be an anti-vaxxer. Like true anti-vaxxers and like doomsday preppers and things like, I think there would be like a healthy 20% of the population that were going to be against it. But because the left took a definitive side and the right took a definitive side, it's furthered that divide. And now we're pretty much at a 50-50.
Well, and this is, I think you and I are both I agree with you on that. I think you and I are both kind of weirded out by this because Trump is in favor of vaccines. So you'd think that like both
and it was
parties,
his vaccine.
And it was his vaccine.
It's Operation Warp Speed.
Exactly. It's Operation Warp Speed. His operation. Pence's in some sense, but his really.
Yeah. It's just kind of a shame because the more we fight about it, the less actually gets done. And I don't know. I'm just scared that this could evolve on strain after strain after strain until we're like, well, we can't do too much about it.
Well,
anymore.
we can't do pretty much. I
mean, it's not going to like population ending kind of virus, but it might be like a flu season reoccurrence every summer.
And that's honestly feels like the kind of thing we could handle. Technically, it's just those are people who are dying ultimately that don't need to die. You know, it's not population ending. It's not existential, I think, is for a lot of people, we were worried about that. And in a weird way, the lockdowns have felt kind of existential. Now, I'm not saying that it's not like you're that people are going to die because they're being locked down. But it's like this huge shift, this categorical shift, like this major shift in how you live your life and what you're allowed to do. That feels like a kind of existential shift, is my point, in response to a non-existential virus. And here's my point. I'm not saying we shouldn't have done those things. To be extremely clear, not a dog whistle. I'm saying if we're going to do those things, they need to do a very good job of explaining why. And I'm hitting them because I don't see that. And I don't see them.
If we're going to do those things, we have to do it efficiently.
Yes.
Because the reason why we're having conversations about lockdowns again is because it wasn't done correctly.
Yeah.
Like people, as soon as it started to be, if you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask, no one was checking. And so majority of people, and I was one for a while, was like, oh, no one's wearing a mask. I guarantee about 40% of these people aren't vaccinated.
Yeah.
Who's going to check?
Yeah.
Just because for a year I had to wear a mask everywhere. And like, I've gotten better now, but that was just like, and now I think, so I don't think that this is population ending for the pandemic, but I think it can be economy ending for another lockdown, because it took massive sacrifices, and the big businesses, Amazon, Google, like they all made money, and mom and pops were hurt like crazy. Restaurant owners were hurt so much, and they're not going to recover from another lockdown. They're barely holding on right now.
Which is why I don't see Biden doing that. But it's almost like we got to go to a break. But it reminds me of, there's this sort of classic archetypal thing, whether it's a parent or a leader, manager, whatever. You think of two types of people. One is harsh up front. They're kind of gruff, but they turn out to be pretty competent, and you get to know them and you can get along with them. The other is really nice and lenient up front. And then you don't do whatever it is that they want, and you don't even know that you're not doing what they don't want. And then at a certain point, they turn, and then they just become vicious. And it's like, okay, this is nice. I thought I knew you, but no, you're just a jerk, an incompetent jerk. That second one feels more like the United States. And this is where I'm being controversial. The first one feels more like China. China locks down everything, immediately nips it in the bud. And that's authoritarian and jerkish.
Well, it's because they're authoritarian in nature.
Exactly. And we're not.
They can do that.
We couldn't do that, to be clear. I'm not saying this is a government responsibility.
I don't think North Korea would put out their numbers, but I guarantee they've got that on lockdown.
Exactly.
Like they know exactly what they're doing.
They've dealt with SARS before too. This is part of the whole, the mask wearing thing, is that they had SARS, and then it became a meme, I say. It became a cultural phenomenon where people started to wear masks, which is technically a meme, but they adapted that way. I guess my point is we fall in the second category here in the United States, where like Biden was promising us 4th of July, 70% vaccinated, you can go out and barbecue, you can go outside again. And then it's like 65% vaccinated. No, not quite good enough. And now you got to wear masks again. Everything's kicking back into place. And then we're blaming the unvaccinated, who again, I'll bring up, are largely people of color, kind of racist. There's this whole history here. And my point is, the messaging is so bad, and it's hard to talk about, and people get blocked all the time from social media for bringing things up. I'm meandering at this point, and again, we're going to go into a break.
I think we're so used to our freedoms and I love freedoms. I've been called a libertarian so many times on the show, but I think we're so used to it that when it comes for a sacrifice of freedoms temporarily for the greater good, we get so scared of the idea that we're not going to get them back that it causes so many issues.
Yeah.
So
I can see that. I can totally see that. All right, we're going to go into a break. Coming back, we hope to be joined by Professor Richard Wolff. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By any means necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Although Thomas is out of the studio right now, it's just me, Stranahan, in here. And we're going to be joined by Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff, for those listening, is Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's also a visiting professor in the graduate program in International Affairs of the New School University, NYC. He is the founder of Democracy at Work and host of their nationally syndicated show, Economic Update. His latest book is The System is the Sickness, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. That book is available with his other books, Understanding Socialism and Understanding Marxism, at democracyatwork.info. Professor Wolff, thank you for joining me this morning. It's great to have you as always. How are you doing?
Okay, and yourself?
Good, and better for having you. Thank you for being here. I'm actually, I want to get into a conversation on China and the economy in both the United States and China, tech exports. There are different sides of this, but you are based in or near New York City, right, Professor Wolff?
That's correct. Yes.
So there's a lot of stuff going on there, and I don't want to get too deep into it because, of course, it's off topic. But we can relate it to the economy, and I will. You're living in a city that is implementing this vaccine mandate. A little bit controversial, but hey, that's happening after a lot of economic tumult. I'll put it like that. Serious despair in a lot of cases. We've spoken with our guest Ted Rall frequently. New York City businesses are shuttered across the city, and not like some, a lot of them. In some cases, in some areas, it seems most of them. In an effort to get it back roaring, you have this mandate that Bill de Blasio is implementing, the Key to New York City Pass, where basically, in order to enter into or work at an indoor restaurant, indoor entertainment venue, etc., you will have to show proof of vaccination. Slightly controversial, and clearly they're leading the way on that nationally. So that's a bellwether for national policy, but it's also an economic policy in some sense. In other words, you can measure, is this going to work? How is this going to affect vaccination rates, not just statistically, but also, is this going to be better for the economy? And so I will open up with that. Compared to the options, the other alternatives here, and there are at least a couple. You could, let everybody come back in and deal with the rising case count. Just let it happen, which is absolutely grim, but technically an option. You can keep things locked down and not do the, slight violation of civil liberties, which is how this comes across to many people. Not require that people be vaccinated, but just keep things locked down. Those are two simple options. Is this one of the better of those options, or is this the best, in your opinion, Professor Wolff?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good question. It's being debated all over the world and certainly all over the United States. Let me respond this way. If you were, and pardon me for using a metaphor, but if you were walking down the street and you were accosted by a person who said to you, I believe in freedom of choice. So I have in my left hand a gun and in my right hand a knife. And it's entirely up to you which one I use to end your life. You choose, please take your time. Your response, if you're not insane, would be not to sit there agonizing over your choice and your quote unquote freedom to do so, but you would be a person who would hopefully would be using your brains to figure out how to get out of a situation in which the options presented to you are clearly not the only ones and not the ones you wish to choose among. For example, you'd like to be able to continue walking down the street, minding your own business and have this crazy person go away rather than agonize over the choices. That's how I look at this situation. I say to myself, on the one hand, that the preponderance of scientific evidence, as best I can judge it, and I live in the same world you do with all the conflicting information, but I make the best judgment I can, and I conclude, and this is in fact the case, that I'm better off with a vaccine than without one. Granted, I'm suspicious about big pharma, and I don't like the government telling me what to do, like other people. But I make the best I can of that situation, and so I want to be vaccinated, and I would like everybody to wear a mask because it has been shown to me, at least, that there's some danger. I don't know how much in not doing it. So that's my preference. But I don't want anyone, and here's where maybe you and I disagree, I don't know, but I don't want anyone to present it to me that either I have a functioning economy or I take risks with large numbers of people's health. I mean, this is like the choice between the gun and the knife. That's not true. It's not necessary. If we want to put New York back, and by the way, your description of areas in New York where stores are closed, you're correct. You're absolutely accurate about that. I live in New York City. I see it all the time. It is a tragedy. It is bad for the economy of New York, no question. But if you want to do something about the economy in New York, and I sure hope folks do, then there are literally a dozen different ways to go about that, none of which require giving up on the health issues I just mentioned. And I understand there's debate about all of this, but we are not, it is really outrageous to present us with the notion either you have a functioning economy or you deal in a rational way with this illness. I mean, that strikes me as kind of remarkable. And it's the same for me on the civil liberties issue that you bring up. Is it an imposition on us of authority of the government that we're suspicious about to tell us we have to do this? Yes, it is. I would rather that not happen. But, you know, I understand as what I think is a reasonable citizen that, for example, when I go in my car and I go cross town to a restaurant with my family, I have to go through 2 or 3 traffic intersections. Now, when I get there, the government has placed a traffic light. And when it's red, the government says, you stop. I don't care when your reservation is. I don't care what the issue is. You stop. And if you go through the red light, there will be a police person and you will get a ticket or arrested or whatever. And I understand the government is taking away a certain freedom that I have, but I understand it's for the greater good. In other words, I need, and everybody else needs, to get through these intersections X times a day. And so the government has arranged limiting our freedom. And, you know, when there are spaces in restaurants a few years ago, where they said, you can't smoke here, I at first understood the kind of anger, a gut-level reaction. Wow, now they're telling me, you know, literally what I can do with my smoking, my mouth, my craving for cigarettes, whatever it might have been. But in the end, the country was persuaded that we would be all better off with a lower risk of lung cancer and all the other things that come from cigarette smoke. And so we understood, yes, cutting back on our freedom over here to smoke in the restaurant is something we can and should live with. For me, we're at exactly the same situation here. And my guess is we're going to end up understanding as a nation that the vaccine mandates and so forth are something we probably need. Now, having said that, last point, I share, even with my right-wing friends, an anger about the imposition here. I share an anger that this wasn't kind of brought to the people, that we didn't have the kind of national debate we could have and should have, that there should have been consultation between employers and employees before the one imposes Remember, the employers are the minority, the employees are the majority. There's already something wrong with a minority telling a majority what to do. That's an unhealthy thing. We didn't have to do it that way. And the same applies to government bureaucrats telling us. And so I empathize with that. I understand that opposition. I just don't want us to be trapped in the either or, that we either are healthy or take care of our health, or we sacrifice the economy because, let me give you one example of what we could do here in New York City. The biggest single problem to our economy is the distribution of income and wealth. New York City is home to people who have wild amounts of money, which they do not spend. There's literally no way for a billionaire to do that each and every day. If that money were instead distributed in a less unequal way across the population, you would find people with their masks and with their social distancing finding plenty of ways to buy commodities, thereby giving people jobs, producing the commodities. If we really want to put the stores back in business, you've got to do something about their single biggest problem, which isn't COVID. It's the fact that there isn't a population out there in a position to sustain the stores the way they did 10, 20, 30 years ago.
I think that's at least a very least a large part of the problem. I mean, this is also, you could say the definitions of these things better, but this seemed partly like a supply side shock. It certainly supply chain disruptions around the world dramatically disrupted the price of products, which means I was looking. It's a random instance, but just sometimes these things can be illustrative. The price of boba tea, the tapioca pearls that appear in boba tea, last year during a week all across the country rose precipitously. In like cafes in California, San Francisco, New York, the Midwest, et cetera, all because, a combination of factors, but put simply, supply chain disruptions. Plenty of, causes you can untangle. But my point is that hit too. Having said that, I completely get what you're saying, and that's where the sort of Fordian approach to the economy comes in, although that might not be the most exemplary version of it. But basically making sure that people have enough money to buy your products. That's the most self-serving sort of prerequisite for this stuff. We've got to go into a break, Richard, and I wanted to, we spent a good amount of time on this. I want to pivot when we come back, but one brief follow-up question. Not explicitly economical in nature, but just using you as our resident New Yorker, do you feel like people are going to respond to this, to the vaccine mandate by de Blasio, in a similar way to how you are? A little bit cautious, a little bit cynical, but overall accepting it, understanding where it's coming from, and willing to comply, willing to go along with that?
Yes. Short answer to your question is that's what I think is going to happen. With grumbling, some of which I hope I've made clear I sympathize with, and I will grumble along with them. But if in the end you're presenting me with this either or, I think that's what people are going to do. They're going to grumble. And there's one thing I would add. They may be so angry and upset about how this was handled that may become a bigger issue and surprise us than the mandates themselves. In other words, the anger isn't about do I have to wear a mask or not, or do I have to get a shot or not. When a baby is born in a New York City hospital, I don't know about the rest of the country, it automatically gets half a dozen shots. Smallpox, it's just nobody even asks you really about it. Your baby is born, they check that the baby is healthy, and they give them certain shots that we have learned over the millennia are diseases that could really hurt little babies, and so we give them a shot, and we accept it. But I do think, and I suspect, that there will be political ramifications about the imposition of this, the autocratic, bureaucratic, minority telling the majority what to do. That wasn't necessary. It could have been handled in a much more, if you allow me, democratic way.
Yeah.
That will become an issue.
it could have been handled so much more gracefully. And this is, I think, I keep coming back to this, and I think this is a common ground for a lot of people. And it's a way to resolve one of the more contentious political divides that we deal with in this country right now and around the world. The whole anti-vax versus pro-vax, anti-lockdown versus pro-lockdown, whatever. You get my point. On COVID specifically, this is a big issue. What can bring people together is acknowledging in common that the messaging, the communication by both the American government and many other governments and bodies around the world has been abysmal for so much of this. And if we want to redress those problems for the sake of a future pandemic or just better governance in general, you got to solve it. I think just recognizing it and bring a lot of people together and can kind of cross those divides. We try to do that on this show. I'm going into a break though. When we come back, we're going to be getting into China, the fate of the Chinese economy, their escalating rhetoric as they're sort of starting to contend verbally as well as economically. They've been contending with America economically for a long time. But in terms of words, between the interaction in Alaska earlier this year and between words in the last couple of weeks on trade policy and economic policy specifically, there's a change here. I want to get into this, how China's economy is actually doing, how it differs from ours in the United States, with our guest, Professor Wolf, Professor of Economics Emeritus. When we come back with Professor Wolf in just a minute, we'll be right back.
Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak: The Deadliest Epidemics in Human History. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're joined by Professor Richard Wolf. Quick heads up, I say Thomas and Stranahan, but Jamarl Thomas is out of the studio this morning. It's just me here. With the exception, of course, of our guest, Professor Richard Wolf. He's Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a visiting professor in the Graduate Program in International Affairs of the New School University, NYC. He's the founder of Democracy at Work and host of their nationally syndicated show, Economic Update. His latest book is The System is the Sickness: When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. That book is available with his others, Understanding Socialism and Understanding Marxism, among others, at democracyatwork.info. And last but not least, you can and you should follow Professor Wolf on Twitter at Prof. Wolf, and that's Wolf with 2 F's at the end of it. Professor Wolf, I want to move to China here. I'll start us off very briefly. Like I said as we went into the break, a lot of contention, a lot of conflict right now between China and the United States. I remember when the word came out that America would be withdrawing from Afghanistan by September 11th later this year, I very quickly saw articles coming up in the Washington Post wondering what we would be doing with the troops that we were withdrawing. And at the same time as I saw an article asking that question, I saw another one answering it saying we should be putting those troops in or near China, which seems particularly bellicose to me. But that's a follow-on from Trump's economic policies, and China is responding to it. We've been talking about the rhetoric on this show. I want to talk about economics while we have you. And starting us off briefly, Professor Wolf, is China an ascendant superpower, or are they a sort of lingering economic machine that nevertheless has these fundamental problems? They'll contract, the middle class is rising, and they're overextended, and their monetary policy isn't working. There's this narrative on that side, and then there's this narrative that says that they're actually rising, they're doing quite well, they're going to beat out the United States, and we simply aren't ready for it. This is the big question, I think, applicable to China if you want to understand, how they'll fare and how we'll have to relate to them. And I'm just setting us up. Where do you fall on that one, Professor Wolf?
Yeah, I pay very close attention. And, the interesting way to answer to the way you've set it up is to say that both of these alternatives that you listed are, in my judgment, correct. In other words, yes, China is the, not a, but the ascending economic superpower, and also that there are many problems, weaknesses, overextensions, risky aspects of what they are doing. But you know, you can be an ascending power and have all of those problems. You can also be a descending power and have those problems. What I find, and I'm amused always by this when I have to explain it to people, many of the problems the Chinese have are very similar to the problems we have. And when you think about it, that isn't all that surprising, because these are the two biggest, most powerful economic units, People's Republic of China, the United States of America, in the world today. So you shouldn't be all that surprised that they share all kinds of problems. Let me give you a couple of examples. One of the things critics of China point to, quite rightly, is that they have made massive use of credit. Local governments in China, businesses in China are very heavily indebted. The government is very powerful in allocating credit. When it wants to develop a region, it gives that region, its cities, its towns, its counties, its businesses, all kinds of access to credit, which allow them, of course, to expand, to hire more people, and to build up that area. If they want something to stop, they withdraw the credits, and it stops pretty quickly. This last week, they made a couple of decisions. And, you know, it had enormous impact, the value of the shares on the stock market in China. And yes, it has a very big stock market, kind of like the one in the United States. The value of those shares collapsed because the government said, we're not funding this stuff anymore. One example, private schools tutoring children. The government said this is creating a split society. Those who have the money to hire a tutor and their kids do better, and those who don't have the funds to hire a tutor and their kids do worse. And this is creating splits we don't want. And therefore, and that was the end of the story for the private companies whose share collapsed on the stock market and so on. But then I come to the United States and I want to explain to everyone, we are now an economic system at least as dependent on credit as is the Chinese. The level of indebtedness of our government is greater than it has ever been. We had a deficit last year, as well as this year, fiscal years, in excess of $3 trillion. The government, in short, spent $3 trillion more than it took in taxes. And the way it does that is it borrows that money in order to be able to do that. So the government is in record debt. But the corporations of the United States are now in record debt, at least as dramatically. In fact, their debt has gone up even faster than the government's in percentage terms. And at the household level, Americans personally are in greater debt than they have ever been as a community. We have the mortgage debt, which is the biggest, the car debt, that's how we drive around, the credit card debt, which is literally how we get around day to day, and then the new enormous one, student debt. So we're an economy awash in a dependence on credit. I mean, conservative economists who used to say, well, we have the private sector and we have the public sector. Yeah, we do, but here's the fact that you have to understand. The private sector in the United States is, with a few exceptions, now on life support from the government in the form of credit. And that, ironically, is one of the criticisms of China. Last point, and I don't want to keep babbling in front of you here.
No, this is great, please.
The Chinese economy has demonstrated a capacity to grow. And we may not like it. We may not like what China is politically or ideologically, and all of that's debatable, and we can discuss it. But if you allow me to put on my economist's hat, I was born in the United States. My education has been only at United States universities, and I've taught economics all my life here in the United States. So I am now going to apply to what the Chinese have accomplished the economic analytical tools that I was raised on here in the United States. over the last 25 years, on average, the output of goods and services in China grew between 6 and 9% per year. Over the exact same period, a quarter of a century, excuse me, the American economy grew between 2 and 3%. This is not a sustainable arrangement. One economy is growing very much faster than the other, and it's only then a matter of time before they catch up. We used to be suspicious that the numbers weren't quite right, that the Chinese government was exaggerating the plus sign and all of that. And that may have been true. There's no way for a person like me to know. But you know, the way we test that always is to see whether it's sustained. And the Chinese have sustained it. Let me give you the second example. The real wage, the average wage a Chinese worker gets, adjusted for the prices he or she has to pay for the goods and services they buy. That's what we mean by real wage. What you can afford with it, has quadrupled over the last 25 years in China. It's one of the reasons the government there is as free to function as it is, because the mass of the Chinese people are simply blown away by what has happened to their standard of living, which has been a better performance than any of them expected from their Communist Party government, which puts the government, of course, in a very, how shall I put it, one can be jealous of the kind of power they have given that kind of performance.
Support.
By the way, over the same period of time, the average wage, real wage in the United States went nowhere. It's stagnant. I mean, the difference is as stunning as anything you can point to. And that has to be faced. If we don't face it, and I really make an appeal here, if we don't face it, we are heading into a period of conflict and tension. Let me remind you of the history of the United States. We began as a minor secondary colony of a big global world power, the British Empire. After a while, we became strong enough and big enough that we were able to say, hey, we don't want you telling us, we're doing well, but we're doing well on our own, and you're becoming an obstacle, you who literally carved out this place for us. Because, of course, it was the Europeans who came here, who developed the economy and basically slaughtered the people they found here. And then at a certain point, the British said, no, you can't do that anymore. We're the British Empire. And we here in the United States made a revolution, a violent revolution to say, no, you're not in charge here anymore. And we did that. And a few years later, in the War of 1812, they tried to undo our revolution. And we showed them again with a military conflict that this is not doable. And they had to back away to the point where today we, the U.S., is the empire and the United Kingdom is a colony in all economic respects that matter. I think the United States better be very careful how it proceeds now, that it doesn't replicate a decline that will not be a happy experience, because it's already underway. And part of our problems are we haven't been willing to face what it means to be on the downside of the mountain, because we had such a good ride over the last 150 years when our economy was ascending. And I don't want to take away from that. We accomplished important things in those 150 years. Capitalism has to its credit a whole host of things that it did, just like it's responsible for some horrors. But that's the past. We have to face now the reality that there is a real competitor. And the United States hasn't had it for a century. It's hard for us. I want some compassion for us. This is a difficult position to be in, but you don't make progress by pretending it isn't there.
Agreed. I guess maybe I don't know. Age has given you some maturity or wisdom or perspective or something like that. I think I'm less forgiving. It's been 70 years. It's been for much longer than I've been alive that it feels we've been in this nap, that we were effectively subsidized by a war. Our growth was set up by this process. It's not just our natural resources, it's the post-war period, of course. And then we've been in this like 70-year-long nap. And I can't help but feel that there are people who are asleep at the wheel and who know on some level that they are asleep at the wheel, but that's maybe where I go wrong. Coming back to China, one brief point here. it's international capital and international investors, this investor class that I presume exists as a single class around the world. If China is in the business of not necessarily yet nationalizing big companies, but at least taking strong regulatory, making large moves there in a way that's going to affect their stock valuation, well, international capital looks at that and says, hey, this is not necessarily the best money-making opportunity for me. Or forget the investors, founders. You have Chinese folks and, people coming from around the world more broadly, coming to the United States because it's like, hey, I can start my startup here. This is going to make a lot of money. They come here because of the unyoked regulatory environment. Well, they do the same with China. And if they don't, isn't that China hamstringing itself? And I understand that they have many reasons to restrain these businesses, beneficial, benevolent and not. But I think you see where I'm coming from. The international investors and just the business community in general is going to be pretty wary of that, right?
Absolutely. That is a problem for the Chinese. By the way, they talk about this politically. They debate it in their scientific and journals and newspapers. So yes, you're right. But they do understand that. They understand that if you come to China to do business as an international capitalist from the U.S., from Japan, from France, or any place else, you are going to be subject to a government that has an agenda, and that if you and your business conflict with that agenda, the chances are you're going to have to give way, not this very powerful government. Absolutely. So the Chinese have answered that situation as follows. We will take other steps to give you levels of profit you can't get anywhere else. We will control you, absolutely, but we will also do a whole host of things that will make your business profitable. And the result of that approach, because that is their approach, the result of that approach is something Americans, again, don't want to face. China is more an economy of private capitalists today than at any point in its history. It has opened itself up not only to Chinese people setting up private capitalist businesses and, by the way, becoming billionaires in the process. It has also opened itself up to foreign, that is, non-Chinese businesses coming in from all over the world, including a hefty number from the United States, because the Chinese government delivered on what I just said. It gave them profits they can't get anywhere else, which is why General Motors sells more cars today in China than it does in the United States. And if you force, let me do this in another way that may provoke you. If you force big businesses in the world to choose between access to the Chinese market, the Chinese economy, versus access to the United States, you're in for a very disappointing outcome. Because, even in the case of Hong Kong, all the attention to Hong Kong and China's government control of this former British colony, et cetera, and the constriction of civil liberty. If you look at what happened in Hong Kong, the business community hasn't left at all. Individuals have, people, but the business community wants in on Hong Kong. And the reason is simple. China now, with its 1.4 billion people, better than 4 times the population of the United States, has some of the lowest wages in the world still, even though the wages have grown. And they have the most expanding market anywhere in the world. And every graduate of a business program and every new MBA in this country learns that one of the things you want to do when you become a CEO of a business is you want to be where it is economical to produce and where the market is expanding. Well, if you follow those rules, you're heading to China.
Makes perfect sense. And that has been the narrative. And I think the question is whether it will continue to be the case. Right. And that's obviously what we're talking about, the implications of the conversation we're having. Professor Wolf, we're over time slightly. We have a caller called in with a question for you, though. Can we keep you on for another minute to take this call?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Thank you for that. Again, joined by Professor Richard Wolf, Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, also other cool things and titles I'll come back to as we outro him, but I want to get to Tarif. Calling in from New Orleans, Tarif is back with a question for Richard. Tarif, you're on. What are you calling in about, Tarif?
Yeah, question, comments. This one for Professor Ruth. And also the last thing was dealing with the war games dealing with the South China Sea. I forgot to mention that. Okay, China, the other three things to crack down on in China, besides the online learning, was cryptocurrency mining, also security data. To crack down on that, and to crack down on Alibaba and other companies as big as Alibaba, because it was gobbling up other companies. They was becoming a monopoly, so they cracked down on them. And also, I want to also say the reports of a retired general from Taiwan was saying that a coup should happen in Taiwan because of China is not the same. So the Taiwanese military should rise up against the government and overtake them, because if they go to war with China, they will lose. And China have highly advanced economy now and technology where they can wipe out the Taiwanese military. That's all I wanted.
That gets a little bit more geopolitical, and you brought up a couple of different economic things that weren't direct questions but might spark some thoughts. Professor Wolf, anything you want to say in response to that? Any comments there?
Yeah, no, I think he's brought up a number of the kinds of important economic issues that illustrate the situation we're in. For me, the most amazing thing is that the Chinese, over the last 60 years of their communist party control of the country after their revolution in 1949, they didn't get any foreign aid from the United States or from the West, like almost every other country in the so-called third world did. They had to do it on their own, and they had an immense problem of huge poverty that had existed for centuries. I mean, the level of obstacles and difficulties they faced was stupefying. They'd been at war basically since 1931, when the Japanese first invaded in Manchuria, all the way through to 1945. That's 14 years of virtually continuous, devastating warfare on their soil. I mean, to say that now, 70 years later, they're the number two economy in the world and fast approaching number one status is a testimony to the fact that they're doing something over there that is the envy of the rest of the world. The United States may be looking at them frightened, but for the rest of the world, this is the kind of success they dare not even dream of. And we have to face that as a nation rather than to pretend that because what they do with their Uyghur population, or what they did in Hong Kong, or the little noises that are happening in the South China Sea, those really are footnotes. They may be horrible injustices, I don't know. But that's really not the issue here, because they are relative to what the big picture is, very much secondary. And that has to be faced, or else, again, my fear that we'll get caught up in the little details of competition. And as you put it at the beginning, the statements, the bellicose statements on one side or the other. And that's really beside the point. And by the way, most of the leaders, including Biden's administration, they know what I'm saying. They're sitting down at the same day that they make some bellicose statement. Lower officials are working out details of treaties and arrangements to suit their respective business communities. And again, that reality has to be faced.
Agreed. I'm gonna close it out here. I mean, real brief last thought. For a while, it's a gloating sense that we'd won China over with Deng Xiaoping and the opening of China and pulling them away from the Soviet Union, that their economic policies, them changing their economic policies, making them more capitalistic and market-friendly, market-oriented, there's a kind of like gloating sense of success. And then, that's clearly not exactly how they view it. Sure, they're moving maybe slightly in this direction, but it's, China, socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's not necessarily a concession to capitalism so much as a development necessarily. Then we're like, okay, that's working for them. And it clearly is working for them very well. Then it starts to work too well. and they start to, manipulate their monetary policy, as is their right, I would assume. They start to, change how their currency is valued and do these things. The IP theft gets more complicated, but then there's this sense of like, hey, you're not playing fair now, trying to sort of find the ways they've broken the rules of the game. And I wonder if at some point the tables will have turned, and instead of us seeing them imitating us, we'll start to imitate them, and we'll talk about, American capitalism with American characteristics or something like that.
I think we should discuss it because I think you got your finger exactly on it. And I think leading elements here in the United States are already talking about adopting some of the things of China precisely for the logic you just laid out.
Very interesting and something to come back on another time. Professor Wolf, thank you. Admirable staying overtime with me. And great conversation, as it always is. Of course, Professor Wolf, really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you for your program. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you on it.
Always, and ditto, and more the same for you. Professor Richard D. Wolf, our guest, whose voice you just heard, is Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's also a visiting professor in the Graduate Program in International Affairs of the New School University, NYC. He's the founder of Democracy at Work and host of their nationally syndicated show, Economic Update. And his latest book, he's an author, his latest book is The System is the Sickness, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. That book is available along with his other books, Understanding Socialism and Understanding Marxism. Find those at democracyatwork.info. Oh, and you can also follow Professor Wolf on Twitter at Prof. Wolf, and that's Wolf with 2 F's at the end. This has been another edition of Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I want to thank Tarif for calling in a couple of times. I want to thank our producers, Austin and Cordell. I want to thank our engineer, Andre. I want to thank my co-host, even though he's not here with me. I hope he's doing all right, Jamarl Thomas. And I want to thank you for listening to this morning's show. Have a great day, folks. We'll be back tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Eastern. Signing off. See you on the other side.